seated. All right, we're here in cause number W13CA043, John R. Erickson versus Bluff Creek Publishers, Inc. Announcements?
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Scurry. Together with my co-counsel, Scott Smith, we represent the plaintiff in this case, Mr. John R. Erickson. Your Honor, we do have a notice of appearance for the court if Your Honor would like one.
You have what?
A notice of appearance, Your Honor, if Your Honor would like one.
I don't need a notice of appearance.
Yes, Your Honor. And we do have some housekeeping matters and motions whenever Your Honor is ready.
All right, we'll take those up in just a moment.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Caroline Power for the defense, Bluff Creek Publishing, and with my co-counsel, Victoria Miranda.
All right, thank you. All right, do we have some pretrial matters to take up? If we do, we're running short on time today, so let's be very brief with it.
Yes, Your Honor. May counsel assume that all witnesses have been pre-sworn?
May what?
May we assume that all witnesses have been pre-sworn, Your Honor?
Is any objection to that?
No objection.
All right, yes, you may.
And may we assume that all sidebars are constructive, meaning that we ask for a sidebar, but then we don't approach for scoring purposes
Any
for the
objection?
jurors?
No objection, Your Honor.
So assumed.
Would Your Honor like us to ask permission before approaching the bench?
Yes, that would be nice.
And would you like us to ask permission each time before approaching the witness, or just the first time?
Just the first time will be fine.
Would Your Honor like to see all demonstratives as we are posting them to the jury today?
Yes, I'd like a copy of the demonstratives.
Yes, Your Honor. Okay. Now, we have talked with opposing counsel pre-trial, and we have come to some agreement on our motions in limine today.
All right.
Specifically, Your Honor, I spoke with opposing counsel about excluding anything related to Polecat Pete, which was a prior work written by the author, the defense's author today, Ms. Rosie Meyers.
All right.
Your Honor, that would include exhibits 20, 21, 23, 24, and any mention of Polecat Pete.
Any objection to that?
No, Your Honor.
All right. So motion's granted.
And Your Honor, with that, plaintiff is ready to proceed with opening
Does
statements.
defendant have any pretrials?
Yes, Your Honor, there are some additional stipulations to add to that list. We've agreed to exclude Exhibit 7. It is an invoice from Maverick Books.
Okay.
We've also agreed to exclude Exhibit 12, a letter that Mr. Erickson received.
All right.
And we've agreed to exclude Exhibit 27. It's a complaint previously filed against Mr. Scurry, the president of Bluff Creek Publishing. We've also agreed to leave out any testimonial mention of that previous case.
All right.
With that, we're ready to proceed.
All right. Any objection to those exclusions?
No, Your Honor. Of course, all of this is subject to not opening the door or needing it for impeachment purposes.
All right. Very well. Insofar, it's not a stipulation to exclude them, but a motion in limine. Is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. The motion in limine is granted as to 7, 12, and 10B7. All right. Counsel for plaintiff may proceed with their opening statement.
And Your Honor, may I have just a moment to set up the courtroom?
Yes, you may. It will be charged to you, though, time-wise.
Yes, Your Honor.
Your Honor, permission to move so I can see the chart as it's used?
Okay. Go ahead and set the chart up.
Sure.
Let's see, could you set it up back there where the jury can see and I can see and it won't be blocking anyone? How about that? Oh, you're going to be working from that podium, right? All right, wherever you want to
yes,
put
Your
it.
Honor.
And then if you have any objections.
We'll just try it right here. How about that? Can you still?
How's that?
Could you
If
still
I could
see?
just stand next to the camera there, Your Honor.
That'll be fine.
And you'll still be able to see this,
Okay.
Your Honor.
I can see that. Can the jury see all right from here? I want to thank the ladies and gentlemen of the jury for being here today. You're really fulfilling your patriotic duty and working in our jury system, so I thank you for your attendance. You
May it
proceed.
please the court.
Okay.
Counsel. Members of the jury. Good afternoon. My name is Scurry, and together with my co-counsel, Scott Smith, we have the privilege of representing Mr. John Erickson. This is Mr. Erickson. Today, you're going to hear about Mr. Erickson's story and about what happened to him. You're going to learn today that Bluff Creek Publishing, the defendants in this case, stole his dog. Members of the jury, you're going to learn today that Mr. Erickson, he's an author, a well-known author in the state of Texas, who writes children's books about a dog named Hank. But this Hank, he's not any old dog. I want you, the members of the jury, to see who Hank is. So if you'll just turn your attention to Hank.
It's me again, Hank the cow dog. It takes a special cow dog to be head of ranch security. Ordinary months need not apply. I started preparing them when I was just a little guy. Training, discipline, the whole 9 yards. By the time I left home, I was ready for the big time. But it wasn't easy. Tracking, hunting, living off the land, there was more. Working as a top hand, full ribbon cow dog. Protecting the ranch from cannibals. Training my staff at the security division. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to bark up to something.
Now, Mr. Erickson, 2 years ago, was approached by a man named Mr. Scurry. Mr. Scurry said to Mr. Erickson, "That's a mighty fine dog you have there, Hank, and I want him." Mr. Erickson said, "I'm sorry, but you can't have him. See, Hank's my dog. Hank belongs with me. He belongs here in Texas." Well, Bluff Creek Publishing, that's not what they wanted to hear. They knew that this brand that Mr. Erickson had created over 30 years, selling over 63 books all about Hank, over 2 million copies all about Hank, trading cards, songs, even creating a motion picture. And Bluff Creek Publishing, they wanted a part of that. So one morning, Mr. Erickson, he wakes up and he finds out that Bluff Creek Publishing, when they wanted Hank and couldn't get Hank, they took Hank. They stole him. Now, they took him in a little bit of a different setting, dressed him up in different clothing. But at the end of the day, it was still Hank. You could take Hank out of the panhandle of Texas, but he was still Hank. And that's why we're here today. We're here today to hold Bluff Creek Publishing responsible for stealing Hank the cow dog from Mr. Erickson. See, he is the author and the creator of Hank, which means he is the owner of Hank the cow dog. And when Bluff Creek Publishing took Hank the cow dog from Mr. Erickson, they did what's called copyright infringement. Now, members of the jury, as the plaintiff today, we bear the burden of proof. And that means we have to prove to you through the evidence that Bluff Creek Publishing did, in fact, copyright Mr. Erickson's book, that they did, in fact, steal Hank the cow dog. Now, the judge at the end of trial today, he's going to tell you a lot about the law, and he's going to explain all of this to you. But I just want to give you some guidance as to what we're going to talk about today so that you can follow the evidence with the law that we have to prove. Today, we have to prove, first and foremost, that Bluff Creek copied Hank the cow dog. So how are we going to do that today? Well, we're going to call Mr. Erickson to the stand, and he's going to tell you about where he got his ideas for Hank the cow dog, that they were his ideas, that working on a ranch in Texas, he observed a dog named Hank, and that dog became his friend. That dog became a part of him, a part of his memories, a part of his essence, and that's who Hank is. And you're going to learn that Mr. Erickson found a book called Old Blue that had been published by Bluff Creek Publishing, the same people who wanted Hank. And you're going to find out that when Mr. Erickson looked at this book, when Mr. Erickson looked at Old Blue, he knew that it was Hank, just dressed up a little differently. Then we're going to call an expert to the stand, Miss Cox. And Miss Cox is going to tell you all about how she can tell you that Old Blue is Hank the cow dog. Now, this expert that we're calling Ms. Cox, she has over 30 years of experience in children's literature. She's taught grade school. She's even read Hank the Cowdog to her kids in her school, in her class. But beyond just being familiar with Hank the Cowdog, beyond teaching Hank the Cowdog, she also gives lectures all over the country about children's literature. And she is going to tell you the 6 things that she looked at to determine whether there was in fact a copy of Hank the Cowdog. Now, she's going to tell you that the things that you need to focus on today are the plot, the characters, the setting, the theme, the style, and the illustrations. And members of the jury, by the end of the trial today, by the time you go back to deliberate, all of these boxes are going to be filled. And they're all going to be filled with check marks that show you that Hank and Old Blue have the same plot, the same characters, the same setting, the same theme, the same style, and the same illustrations. And when you see all of that, and all of the evidence is presented before you, you will know that Bluff Creek copied Hank the Cowdog. Now, the next thing we have to prove to you is that they substantially copied Hank's character and essence. And Ms. Cox will tell you more about that, too. She'll tell you what that means. She's going to tell you that it means that when you copy somebody's character, you take that character from their book and try to make it your own, you've got to do a lot more than just slap them in a different part of Texas. You've got to do a lot more than just change a few stories here and there. And that she's going to tell you that these copies, these similarities are significant, that they're substantial, because they are Hank. They are Mr. Erickson's dog. Now, the third thing we have to prove to you today is that Bluff Creek knew Myers copied Hank the Cowdog. Today, you're going to learn that when Bluff Creek wanted Hank the Cowdog and couldn't get him, they stole him. And why do I say that? Because the evidence is going to show you today that the day that Mr. Erickson told Bluff Creek Publishing that he was not interested in working with them, that they contacted another author, a young author who had never written a book before. And this young author, she may not have known what was going on at the time, but let's just say Bluff Creek Publishing, they made Miss Myers their patsy. See, they got Miss Myers to write the book they wanted. They got Miss Myers to write Hank the Cowdog. And that's exactly what Bluff Creek Publishing wanted. They wanted Hank, so they took Hank. Now, the last thing we have to show you today is that they induced or caused Myers to copy Hank the Cowdog. And today you're going to learn that they gave Miss Myers Hank the Cowdog. When they signed the contract with Miss Myers, they handed her Mr. Erickson's dog. Now, members of the jury, I say Mr. Erickson's dog because even though this is just pages, you're going to learn today it's a lot more than that. This is Mr. Erickson's work. It's his blood, sweat, and tears. It's his memories. It's his dog. Members of the jury, by the time you look at all the evidence today and you see that we've met every element that we're required to meet under the law, you will know that Bluff Creek Publishing stole Hank the Cowdog. And I'm going to come before you at the end of trial and I'm going to ask you to give Hank back. Give Hank back to his owner, Mr. Erickson. Put Hank back where he belongs, with his owner, his creator. I'm going to ask you to hold Bluff Creek Publishing liable for stealing Hank the Cowdog, and I'm going to ask you to make them pay. And when you look at all the evidence, you'll be able to do just that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, counsel. All right, counsel for defendant.
Your Honor, would you mind if I turn the podium around?
No, feel free to.
May proceed. May it please the court, counsel, members of the jury. I want you to picture a cowboy out on the range. Do you have an image in your head? Now, I imagine that your image is a little bit different than your image, and I bet that your image is a little bit different still. We all have different life experiences. We've all seen different cowboy movies in different parts of Texas. But you know, I imagine that all of our images of a cowboy on the range share certain elements. A particular hat, a pair of boots, maybe a horse. Members of the jury, a cowboy on the range, that's a theme. A theme we're all familiar with, and a theme that we have seen performed hundreds of different ways. Variations on a theme. That's what this case is about. Whether these two books, Old Blue and Hank the Cowdog, are nothing more than variations on a theme. Members of the jury, today I represent Bluff Creek Publishing and its president and creator, William Scurry. Now, Bluff Creek Publishing is not some big publishing house like Penguin or Viking. Bluff Creek is based here in Texas. In fact, Mr. Scurry created it specifically to promote Texas artists. I'd like you to meet Mr. Scurry. Would you mind standing up? This is Bill Scurry. He was a publisher working all over the country in all different kinds of publishing, but he decided to come back to Texas for a specific purpose. Thank you, you can have a seat. His purpose was to get Texas books with the essence of Texas, but to give those books a wider appeal. To make it so that people outside of Texas, people in cities, could relate to those books and could share in what Mr. Scurry loves, Texas art. That's what Mr. Scurry was thinking when he approached Mr. Erickson. You see, Mr. Erickson is based in Texas, and as you've heard, his books have to do with a cow dog on a cattle ranch protecting the ranch from coyotes. It's like a children's version of that same cowboy story. Classic. So when Mr. Scurry approached Mr. Erickson, he wanted to change the books just a little bit. See, that's what opposing counsel forgot to mention, that Mr. Scurry didn't want Hank the way that Hank was. He wanted Hank with some changes. That appeal that reaches out to the kids in the East Coast cities and kids from different kinds of homes. You'll hear throughout the trial today that Hank the Cowdog has a rather traditional family structure. That's great. He has a mom and a dad, the humans. He has a sidekick, and he has his adventures within that structure. Mr. Scurry wanted to change a few things. Mr. Erickson said no. Not only did he say no, he said that those changes to Hank were too major, that they would fundamentally change the Hank stories, that they would change who Hank is. So, Mr. Scurry looked elsewhere. Now, you've heard about Old Blue. And Old Blue is written by a woman named Rosie Meyers. You'll get to meet her here in court today, and you'll get to hear her side of the story about where Old Blue comes from. You see, Rosie Meyers also grew up in Texas. She grew up on a chicken farm, but that chicken farm had a working dog, a dog that protected the farm from the critters around, a dog that chased the critters, that in her mind was a talking dog in a children's book. That first chapter that she sent William Scurry, before she ever heard from William Scurry, before they ever talked about Hank, that first chapter was a talking dog living on a farm, protecting the farm from predators. And you'll hear that that story is based on her own life, her own time. It's her own variation on that theme. Now, Mr. Scurry wanted a classic Texas book, and he didn't feel like a chicken farm really portrayed classic Texas. So yes, the book became a cattle farm. And the predators, instead of raccoons looking for eggs, became coyotes looking for chickens. Members of the jury, it's just like the cowboy wearing the boots and the hat and the horse. They're the elements of that theme. The cowboy, the cow dog, Now, members of the jury, the plaintiff has the burden here today to prove their case. And they have the burden to prove it by a preponderance of the evidence. That means the greater weight of the evidence. They have to show that it's more likely than not that they're right. But they cannot do that today. At the end of the trial, you'll be asked 3 questions. First, are the similarities in the books protected? Second, are there substantial differences? And third, did the defendant encourage Ms. Meyers to copy anything in the book? Now, similarities that are protected, let's start there. With the variation on a theme, the essential elements of that theme, they're not protected under the law. It means that there's something so common that everyone knows, and they're available for anyone to use in their work. For something to be protected, it can't be common. It can't be something that's usually used, like a cow dog on a ranch protecting the ranch from coyotes. You'll hear today, though, that these 2 books have massive similarities. Excuse me, major differences. The differences that drove Mr. Erickson to say no to Bluff Creek. Hank is a happy-go-lucky dog. He has misadventures, but he's always trying to do the right thing. He's always trying to find the justice in the world, and he always assumes the best of people. But Old Blue has a more worldly view. He's a little bit cynical. He tries to play pranks on his owners, tries to get even, and his story is a little bit scarier. You'll hear a lot about the 2 books today and the details of those differences. And when you come to that 3rd question, whether Bluff Creek encouraged Miss Meyers to copy anything from that book, well, you'll hear the story of how Miss Meyers' book was written, how she started with her own experiences, with Mr. Scurry's collaboration, and how when Mr. Scurry gave her that Hank book, it wasn't to say, copy this book. It was to say, avoid this cliche. Give me something different. This is not what I want. It's exactly why Mr. Scurry asked Mr. Erickson to make changes. He wanted those changes with Miss Meyers. Members of the jury, we're here today because Mr. Erickson wants to copyright an entire theme. He wants to copyright the cowboy, the cow dog, the ranch, every situation that you can imagine happening on that ranch, the fact that coyotes attack a ranch, the idea that a children's book could have a talking dog as the protagonist. Members of the jury, Mr. Erickson is here to stifle the creative voice of other children's authors, authors like Rosie Meyers, publishers like William Scurry. But at the end of this trial, I will come back to you and I will ask you to return a verdict that tells Mr. Erickson he can't own the cow dog. He cannot copyright Texas. Hank is not the only cow dog in Texas. Thank you.
All right, counsel, thank you very much. All right, who will plaintiff's first witness be?
Mr. Erickson, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Erickson, if you will, please come forward. Counsel, how long do you anticipate your direct examination will last?
Well, I'm thinking about 10 minutes or so.
Okay, all right, very well. We are on a limited schedule today, so we do need to move right along, and I understand Mr. Erickson has a plane to catch at 3, so we need to finish by that time, but you don't anticipate any,
Yes, Your Honor.
any problem?
I certainly hope not. We'll make sure we don't.
Very well.
Good afternoon. Can you introduce yourself to the jury, please?
My name is John Erickson. I'm from Harrington, Texas. I am a rancher and an author.
Now, Mr. Erickson, you just said you're a rancher and an author. So tell me, how does a rancher become an author?
Poverty had a lot to do with that. It's hard to make a living as a ranch cowboy. That was a passion with me, being a cowboy. When I was a kid, I never thought about being a writer. But I wanted to be a cowboy as my mother's people had been in West Texas. And when I was old enough to know better, I went to work as a ranch cowboy, and that's how I made my living for 8 years. And I was also writing at the same time, 4 hours every morning. And my plan of becoming Hemingway didn't work out. For some reason, New York was not interested in what I was doing, and so I started writing about my experiences as a ranch cowboy, and I found magazines and newspapers that would pay me $100 a piece for humor articles. And the first Hank story was an attempt to make money for my wife and 2 children who wanted to eat every day, and I wrote it for the Cattleman magazine. They paid me $150, and I never had any idea that Hank would become a star or that I would be working for him.
Now, once you decided to write Hank the Cowdog, can you tell us a little bit about how you started up Maverick Books?
Well, after being an abysmal failure for 15 years, I decided that I would try to do something else besides get rejection slips. And so I stopped sending out query letters to publishers, and Chris and I started our own publishing company in our garage in Perryton, Texas, which was a completely outrageous thing to do. But we thought that people in our part of the country were similar to us, which was we were having a hard time finding books that we didn't insult us, books that were not depressing, books that could give us an honest laugh. And sure enough, there were a lot of those people, and we found them in a little circle about 120 miles around Perryton, Texas. And Hank did well on the first book. He did so well, I wrote a second one. And
How many books have you written now about Hank?
well, we just published 63, and 64 will be out in the fall.
And now I said about Hank, but are all 63, about to be 64 of your books, are they about Hank and his story?
They're all Hank the Cowdog stories.
Now, is there anything else about Hank other than the books that Maverick Books is involved in?
Oh, we have T-shirts, and I do all the stories as audiobooks. And I guess that's we have a game that's based on the Hank stories.
Well, and you're also a bit of an artist as well. You play some music, don't you?
Yes, I do. I've been able to make a living somewhat as a performer for about the last 30 years. I've made a lot of tracks across Texas and done a lot of Hank programs in schools, elementary schools mostly.
And specifically that music that you play, can you tell the jury what it is, what it's about?
Well, there's songs. Some of them are sung by buzzards, some of them are sung by coyotes and cannibals, and some of them are sung by Hank, some of them are sung by Little Alfred, and Sally Mae, the ranch wife. But they all help to express this little world of Hank the Cowdog, and you can express certain things with music that you can't with just words and characters. And music was always an important part of my life when I was growing up, and since I was paying all the publishing bills, I could do whatever I wanted to do, and I wasn't qualified to write music or perform it, but I did it anyway, and people paid me for it, so it's a nice deal.
Now we've heard about your background with Hank and how Hank got started, but was there anything specific in your life that gave you the idea to write about Hank?
No, there really wasn't. I had been writing for 15 years, and I didn't know what my proper voice was. I'd spent 6 years in universities, and I had to unlearn a lot of bad habits. So it took me a while to figure out what my proper voice was. And one of the nice things about not quitting is that after 15 years of riding every day, you're liable to stumble on something that is actually gold and not fool's gold.
Now, Mr. Erickson, can you tell the jury about the Australian Shepherd, I believe,
Objection, Your Honor. Leading.
Excuse me?
Leading, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Tell us about the Australian Shepherd that was in your past.
When I was working as a ranch cowboy in Beaver County, Oklahoma, in the 1970s, my neighbor came home from a horse show with an Australian Shepherd that somebody had sold him for $300. Had told him that it would take the place of 3 cowboys. And what he didn't tell him was that you have to train these dogs. And in my part of the country, we have a lot of cow dogs, and most of them don't know what they're supposed to do. And so they just go around and bark. And they cause trouble. They get cattle mad at them, and then they go hide behind a cowboy, and the cow wipes out the cowboy. So that was Hank. He had a heart of gold. He thought he was head of ranch security, and he was about 3 bales short of a full load. And I thought of that dog, he was funny, he was a fool, but he didn't know that. He never understood why people screamed at him.
Now, Mr. Erickson, I want to talk to you briefly about how you came to know Bluff Creek Publishing. Do you know Bluff Creek Publishing?
I do.
And how do you know Bluff Creek Publishing?
Well, my business associate, Gary Rinker, was contacted by them. They were interested in publishing the Hank books.
And did you ever work out an agreement with Bluff Creek Publishing for them to publish your Hank books?
No.
Why not?
Well, they had in mind some changes that we weren't interested in making.
Thank you. Pass the witness.
All right, cross-examine.
Thank you. May I proceed? Mr. Erickson, you were just describing the dog that you based Hank off of. Would you call that a typical dog?
Well, he was typical of stock dogs, I think. Of course, every dog is unique. They all have certain characteristics of other dogs, but stock dogs have bad habits that are different from Pomeranians' bad habits.
So Hank was typical of the dogs you knew on the ranch. Is that right?
Possibly so, yeah.
The way you write your stories, you give Hank a particular morality. Isn't that right?
Yes,
You base your stories off of a sense of justice.
yes,
In fact, with your structure, your stories are always seeking justice.
yes.
Now, Bluff Creek Publishing isn't the first company that asked you to make changes to Hank, are they?
No,
Back in 1984, you had a deal with CBS, isn't that right?
yes,
Now, CBS wanted to make a cartoon version of Hank,
yes,
and at first you were very excited about it.
yes,
You signed over the rights to Hank,
yes,
but then you saw the episode.
yes.
When you saw the episode, you were disappointed,
I was.
you were stunned,
I was.
you were outraged,
Yes,
because CBS made changes to the story in Hank. Isn't that right?
yes,
Specifically, they made the head of the ranch a woman,
yes,
and she was unmarried, wasn't she?
yes,
After CBS, Disney considered making a full-length motion picture of Hank the cow dog, right?
yes,
At first you were interested,
yes.
but Disney wanted the rights to Hank again.
All rights in all parts of the universe in all languages, known and unknown.
Thank you for the specificity. They wanted to have the ability to change the story of Hank yet again.
Yes,
And in fact, they wanted a story in which there was worlds collide. Hank meets the city.
yes,
And you thought that that change was a big change.
yes,
Too major of a change.
yes,
You turned Disney down, didn't you?
yes.
And that's when Bluff Creek came around. When Mr. Scurry asked you about Hank, he suggested some changes, didn't he?
Yes,
Changes that you felt were major changes.
correct.
Those changes were a different family structure,
Yes,
maybe something that would reach out to the kids in the city.
possibly.
And again, you felt that those changes were major,
Yes,
too major,
yes,
and you turned Mr. Scurry down.
yes.
After that, you saw Old Blue, isn't that right?
I saw Old Blue.
You saw the cover of the book,
Yes.
Old Blue. And you judged that book on its cover, didn't you?
By the cover and some of the text.
Some of the text, the table of contents.
The list of chapters in the first page or two and the last page or two.
So the very first page, a few of the last pages, and the table of contents.
Yes, and the illustrations.
You didn't read Old Blue when you saw it that day, did you?
No,
You didn't read Old Blue before you filed this lawsuit.
no.
In fact, you didn't read Old Blue before coming into court today.
That's correct.
Pass the witness.
All right, redirect.
Just briefly, Your Honor. Mr. Erickson, why didn't you read Old Blue?
Well, I didn't think that it was necessary.
Why not?
I saw the similarities to what I was doing, and I didn't have the desire to read the whole thing.
Mr. Erickson, briefly, can you tell the jury what the similarities were that you saw?
Well, of course, the size of the book was part of it. The number of chapters, 12 chapters. The titles. It's very unusual for a book in this day and age to have chapter 1 and then a title. That's an old-fashioned approach to writing. It's the sort of thing that Mark Twain did, but most writers today would not put a chapter title. I do, and that book did also. It involved a dog who lived on a ranch and thought of himself as a head of security, used a different term, but the idea was the same. And it seemed to me that it was had been borrowed.
Thank you. No more questions, Your Honor.
All right. Any recalls?
Nothing further, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. You may step down. Is there any objection to this witness being finally excused?
No, Your Honor.
No objection.
All right. All right, who will plaintiff's next witness be?
And next it will be Gary Rinker.
Okay, Winker.
Good afternoon. Can you
Hello.
introduce yourself to the jury, please?
I'm Gary Rinker. And
Mr.
I-
Rinker,
That's it. Go ahead.
where are you from?
Perryton, Texas.
And if you could just speak up just a little bit so we make sure that everybody hears you.
Perryton.
Now, Perryton, Texas?
Yes, ma'am.
Have you always lived in Texas?
Yes.
Now, what do you do for a living?
I work for Maverick Books and John Erickson and Hank the Cowdog.
How long have you worked for Maverick Books, John Erickson, and Hank the Cowdog?
I started in 1985, before my senior year of college, as like a summer intern.
Tell us what you do for Maverick Books.
I run the business day to day, and I've negotiated all of our contracts, publishing, media, and all that kind of stuff too.
Well, beyond negotiating contracts, is there anything else that you do with the marketing or branding of Hank the Cowdog?
Oh, I was the one that created the game that we made, and we've done card decks. We designed T-shirts. I do the newsletter. There's a newsletter we send out to the fan club every 3 months, and I put that together.
Referring opposing counsel to what's been pre-marked as Exhibit 11 for identification purposes. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Mr. Rinker, I'm showing you what's been pre-marked as Exhibit 11. Can you tell the jury what Exhibit 11 is?
These are the covers of the Hank 63 books.
Now, is this example of all of the covers of the book, is this a fair and accurate representation of the covers of the book?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, at this time, we would move Exhibit 11 into evidence.
Any objection?
Your Honor, no objection, but we do request a limiting instruction that the jury be instructed today's case is simply about the similarities between Hank number 1 and Old Blue, pursuant to the complaint.
All right, any objection to that instruction?
No, Your Honor.
All right, jury is so instructed. You may proceed, and it is admitted.
Permission to publish to the jury, Your Honor.
Yes, you may.
Now, you said that Exhibit 11 is all of the Hank books?
Yes, ma'am.
And in all of these books that the jury is looking at in Exhibit 11, do they all have anything in common?
It has the Hank logo in the left corner.
Not speaking the covers generally, but just tell me, is Hank in all of the books?
Yes, ma'am.
I can take that down now. Now, how would you describe Hank?
How would I describe Hank? Well, he's the self-appointed head of ranch security. He thinks he runs the place. And as John said, he's usually in the way more than he's helping. He's funny, but he has a good heart. Always intends to do the right thing. In the end, he usually does.
And Mr. Rinker, are you familiar with Bluff Creek Publishing? Do you know them?
Yes.
How do you know them?
Mr. Scurry sent me an email, I believe it was June 21st, saying that he was starting to publish.
Before we talk about that email, I'm actually going to show it to you. Referring opposing counsel to Exhibit 5 and 6. There's 5 and 6 there for you.
Okay.
Now, do you recognize Exhibits 5 and 6?
Yes, ma'am.
And how do you recognize Exhibits 5 and 6?
These are the emails that I received from Mr. Scurry.
And are these emails a fair and accurate representation of the emails as you saw them last?
Yes, they are.
Your Honor, at this time, we would move Exhibits 5 and 6 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection.
Be admitted.
Now, speaking of Exhibit 5 first, the first email, which I believe was what you were about to get into, can you tell us who this email specifically is from and who it's to?
It's from Mr. Scurry, and it's to me.
And what is the subject of the email?
He said that he was coming back and starting a publishing company in Texas. Said he was a Hank fan, said he'd read some books. His kids enjoyed them. And he was going to start a publishing company and publish Texas authors, and was interested in publishing the next Hank book.
Now, after this email, what happened next?
I went to ask John, to talk to John, to see if he would be interested.
And were you interested?
Sure. We said we'd be interested in seeing what they had to offer.
And what happened after you talked to Mr. Erickson about it? Did you hear from Mr. Scurry again?
I got back and talked to him and told him that we would be interested. And that's when I got an email that he wanted me to send in the next book that was unpublished manuscript.
And you're referring to it, the second email, Exhibit 6 now?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, can you just summarize to us what Exhibit 6, what this email talks about?
He was asking me to send him book 61, which I told him I couldn't do because it was unpublished. So I sent him book 1 and book 60, so that they have examples to look at. And I believe that was, that's whenever he told me that they were interested in making changes to Hank. They thought they would give it a broader appeal, make it more interesting to the urban community if we made some changes and modernized it some.
And do you remember in this email how Mr. Scurry described these changes that he wanted to make to Hank the Cowdog?
How?
How he described the changes, if he said if they'd be big or small?
He said nothing big, no major changes. That's what he said.
Now, after he sent you this email, what happened?
After he sent this email, I went back and talked to John, and we said that we wouldn't want to make changes. We like Hank just the way he was.
Now, I'm assuming that you probably told Bluff Creek Publishing that you didn't want to work with them anymore.
Yes, ma'am.
And after that, what was the next thing that happened?
After that, there was nothing until I ran into a book of Old Blue.
Now, when you say you ran into a book of Old Blue, are you referring to Exhibit 2, Book 1 of Old Blue that's already been entered into evidence?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, when you saw Old Blue, what happened?
Well, the title caught my attention because it sounded like a Hank title with the coyote moon and that kind of deal. And so I got the book and looked at it, and when I flipped it over on the back, I saw Bluff Creek Publishing, and I said, oh my goodness. And that's when it hit me that it sounded like, and then I looked through the book more and saw some of the similarities and said, this looks like they went ahead and swiped Hank after all.
Now, when you say you looked through the book, did you read the whole Old Blue book?
I did eventually read the whole book, yes.
And do you remember some of the similarities that you saw other than the cover that you can explain to the jury?
They tried to mimic the way that Hank would talk. There's lots of times when Hank would stop and talk to the audience, tell them things. They used almost identical descriptions of dog food, where Hank calls it sawdust, cheap dog food. He complains that we don't get good dog food. You know, they scrimp on what the dogs get. That was in there, almost exact same words, describing it as sawdust, tasting like liquid detergent, those kind of things. There were times when Hank would turn to the audience and like he was going to get revenge or his idea, and he would say, hey, hey, and that was in their exact same thing. In the first chapter, I noticed afterwards they changed it to he. I guess they forgot to keep the exact copy all the way through, but there were lots of examples like that where they picked up the themes and just kind of the actions of the characters and stuff like that.
Thank you. Pass the witness.
Cross-exam?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Proceed.
Mr. Rinker, you've known Mr. Erickson for a long time.
Yes, ma'am.
In fact, you owe your entire professional career to Mr. Erickson.
That's the only job I've had working for Hank.
That's right. You've worked with him since 1985, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Nearly 30 years.
Almost.
Besides being your only job, Mr. Erickson is also the only person who gave you a shot to become a published author.
Well, we published my book through Maverick Books also, yes.
You wrote a children's book, right?
Yes.
And you tried to get it published for 10 years without success.
I sent it to a few places, yes.
After 10 years, Maverick Publishing was the first to give you a shot.
Well, I actually just did it on my own. I mean, through Maverick Books, I decided I'd do the same thing John did and found an illustrator and just published it on my own.
To be clear, Maverick Books is the company that John Erickson created.
Yes,
And John Erickson is the president of that company.
yes. And I'm the vice president, yes, ma'am.
As the vice president of a company that works in children's books, of course you keep up on the children's books industry.
Oh, yeah, I try to a little bit.
You try to read a lot of children's books.
Yes, read a bunch to my kids.
Your Honor, permission to approach with exhibits 8, 9, and 10.
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, we have no objection to these 3 exhibits coming in.
In that case, Your Honor, I move them into evidence.
They are admitted, 8, 9, and 10.
Now, Mr. Rinker, those are 3 covers of children's books, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
3 children's books that you have read.
I'm familiar. I haven't read all of these, but I've seen the covers.
Now, on direct examination, you mentioned Hank's cover. I'd like us to take a look at the cover of Hank next to the cover of some of these books, starting with, is that Farm Dog Martha you have?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, Farm Dog Martha, you know, is a story about a cow dog. Isn't that right?
I'm not familiar with it exactly, no.
Well, she's a talking dog, right?
I assume so. She's on TV. She probably does talk.
You know because you read the book that she's a talking dog. Isn't that right?
I said I haven't read this one. No, ma'am.
It's your testimony that you've never read Farm Dog Martha?
No, I've never read Martha Speaks.
One moment, please, Your
Yes,
Honor.
ma'am.
Can I have another copy, please? Mr. Rinker, you gave a deposition in this case, isn't that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And before you gave that deposition, you promised to be truthful?
Yes,
You took an oath.
yes,
And after you gave the deposition, you had a chance to look through it and make sure everything you said was accurate.
yes,
After you made sure everything was accurate, you signed that deposition.
yes.
Your Honor, permission to approach with this witness's deposition.
You may.
Directing your attention to the bottom of page 11 there.
Yes,
When you took a deposition, you saw the same 3 covers of those same 3 books I just gave you, including Farm Dog Martha. Isn't that right?
yes,
And you said, yes, I have seen all these. Turning the page, during your deposition, you were asked, is Farm Dog Martha a story about a talking dog that protects her master's sheep from coyotes? You were asked that question?
yes,
Objection, Your Honor. If we may have a sidebar.
Yes, you may.
I believe that this time we've established that this is an improper impeachment. Your Honor, there is no contradiction here. Mr. Rinker has never said in his deposition that he read the books, which is what opposing counsel asked Mr. Rinker. Instead, he said he's familiar with the books and that he's seen the books, but she specifically asked him if he's read them, and he nowhere in his deposition says that.
So what are you requesting?
Your Honor, I'm saying that this is an improper impeachment. I'm asking that we halt this impeachment and stop reading from the deposition at this point.
If I may, Your Honor, the very next line after Mr. Rinker is asked about what the book is, he says, yes, I believe it is, referencing the fact that Farm Dog Martha is about a dog living on a farm protecting her owner's ranch from coyotes.
Objection's overruled. You can cover it on redirect.
So, Mr. Rinker, Farm Dog Martha is about a talking dog on a ranch protecting from coyotes, isn't it?
yes,
Just like Hank?
yes,
Now, you started talking about the cover of Hank on direct examination, talking about the badge with the Hank title. Isn't that right?
yes. That's the logo, Hank logo.
Looking at Farm Dog Martha, we also see her face in a circle at the top of the book, don't we?
Yes, ma'am.
Let's take a look at Brave Dog Blizzard that you have there.
Okay,
You are familiar with Brave Dog Blizzard.
yes,
You know that it is also about a dog, a talking dog, on a ranch, protecting the ranch from predators,
yes, ma'am.
specifically from coyotes.
Specifically from coyotes, I'd have to look back to see. Yes,
Just like Hank.
yes,
And you've read Grin and Bear It, or you're familiar with Grin and Bear It.
yes,
You know that Grin and Bear It is about a talking dog
yes,
on a ranch,
yes,
protecting the ranch from coyotes,
yes, ma'am.
just like Hank.
Mhm.
Is that a yes, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Now let's take a look at Old Blue and Hank. After reading, you know that Old Blue is about a talking dog
Yes,
on a ranch. Is that a yes?
yes,
Protecting the ranch from coyotes.
yes,
Now, when you looked at Exhibit 11 earlier, you saw that all of the different Hank books had the same banner at the top and the same banner at the bottom, correct?
yes, ma'am.
It looks like bricks,
I think it's like old wood paneling.
wood paneling. You don't see wood paneling on the Old Blue cover, do you?
No, ma'am.
And you know that every single book cover of Hank the Cow Dog has Hank on the front of the cover as the illustration.
I believe Hank is in all of them, yes, ma'am.
On the cover of Old Blue, coyotes.
Yes,
Isn't that right? Now, you talked a little bit earlier about your communications with Mr. Scurry. You summarized an email that I'd like us to read in detail. Do you still have Exhibit 7 with you? I believe it's 6, excuse me.
yes, ma'am.
Let's take a look at the bottom of that main paragraph where Mr. Scurry is asking you about changes to Hank. He says, I'm afraid that Hank might be viewed as a relic of a bygone era, that in those markets, referring to the big cities, unless we bring the stories more up to date. Nothing big, no major changes, Just small things that would place the stories in the context of the real world as it really is. That's what Mr. Scurry wanted of Mr. Erickson, isn't that right?
Yes, that's what's said.
Mr. Erickson didn't think...
Mr. Rinker, I'm a little hard of hearing. I'm having trouble hearing. If you could speak up a
Okay,
little bit,
sorry.
please. Go ahead, Counsel.
Mr. Erickson didn't think that these changes were minor, did he?
No, ma'am.
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. Sidebar.
All right.
Your Honor, what Mr. Erickson thought as far as the changes, whether they were major or minor, is irrelevant. What matters is that Bluff Creek Publishing didn't think that these changes were major. And so when they made these minor changes in Old Blue, they knew that they were doing a copyright infringement. They knew they were infringing on Hank the Cowdog. Mr. Erickson's view here is irrelevant.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Mr. Erickson thought that these changes were so major that he refused to make those changes to Hank. Mr. Erickson is a party in this case, so his knowledge and his opinion about the differences between the books go directly to the reliability of his complaint and his reliability as a witness in the case. Furthermore, Your Honor, the fact that these changes were considered major is probative evidence that, in fact, they are.
If I may just briefly respond to that, Your Honor. The copyright law here in Texas does not in any manner, in any way, reflect onto the state of mind of Mr. Erickson. However, it does specifically, under the damages statute, require seeing into the state of mind of the defendant. Therefore, the defendant's state of mind and what he's thinking is the only thing that is relevant in this trial.
Okay, objections overruled. Proceed.
You were saying, Mr. Rinker, Mr. Erickson didn't think those were minor changes, did he?
No, we wouldn't have thought those would have been minor changes.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you. Redirect.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Rinker, I'm going to show you Exhibit 11 again. Do you still have all the copies of Hank the Cowdog and Exhibit 11 in front of you?
I can get it. Yes, ma'am.
Now, opposing counsel just asked you about all of the things that are essentially the same in Hank the Cowdog and a series of books, and I think you believe you said that Hank was in all of them. Is that right?
I believe he's on the cover.
Now, I want to ask you about a few other similarities on the cover. Now, Old Blue is featured with like a blue background. We'd probably say it's at night.
Probably a dark, yes.
Would you like a copy of it?
Yes, please.
Sure. Are there any Hank the Cowdog covers featured in Exhibit 11 that are at night?
Yes.
And are there coyotes on any of the covers?
Yes, ma'am.
And are there coyotes on the cover of Miss Meyers' book, Old Blue?
Yes.
Now, do you know why, go ahead and take that down. Do you know why Maverick Books chose not to sue the other publishers of Farm Dog Martha or Blizzard Dog, the other 3 books we've seen, Exhibit 8, 9, and 10?
Because we wouldn't have felt that those were stealing Hank. They were dogs that were doing their own thing, whereas Old Blue copied the mannerisms and since they had contacted us ahead of time wanting Hank.
Thank you. No more questions.
Thank you. Anything further?
Nothing further from this witness, Your
All
Honor.
right. You may step down. Who will be your next witness, counsel?
Your Honor, the next witness will be Miss Cox.
All right. Ms. Cox.
Your Honor, permission to retrieve the demonstrative.
You may.
Your Honor, permission to move behind the jury to see?
Yes, you may.
Your Honor, will you be able to see this if it's positioned
I can,
here? And
that's
members
fine.
of the jury, can you all see this here? I feel like I might be cutting off some of you a little bit. Yes, okay, great. Good afternoon. Can you introduce yourself to the jury, please?
Yes, my name is Linda Cox. I'm a children's lit teacher here at Baylor.
Ms. Cox, why are you here today?
I was asked to be an expert witness on behalf of the plaintiff.
Ms. Cox, likewise, I know you don't have a microphone. If you could try to project back 4 or 5 rows so that everyone can hear you, okay?
Yes,
Why are you here today, Ms. Cox?
I am here at the request to be an expert witness on behalf of the plaintiff.
Now, I want to talk to you about what qualifies you to be an expert witness. Can you tell the jury about your background? Where did you go to school?
I went to school at Oklahoma State. I have been an elementary teacher. I have been a student teacher or intern supervisor. I've been teaching here at Baylor for 30 years. I have taught probably 40 classes of children's lit. I've taught several classes of English language arts, all of this in preparing teachers for elementary schools.
And have you published any works?
Yes, I have published some things.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the things that you've published?
I've published articles about teaching in a museum setting, a children's museum setting. I've published an article about using nonfiction with children, and I've published an article about gifted and talented, working with gifted and talented children.
Did you come to an opinion in this case?
Yes, I did.
Before we get to your opinion, what did you look at in coming to your opinion?
I looked at several different things, and then I tried to approach it like how I would teach my students in children's lit. And we used what we call 6 literary elements that's coming out of our textbook, comes out of most children's lit textbooks. I looked at the 6 things: character, setting, theme, verbal style, illustration, and plot. And that's how I compared the 2 books.
And specifically, before we get to those, were there any reference materials that you used in coming to your opinion?
I did use the reference book that I have used for the past 6 years in children's lit, the Stute Amsbaugh textbook. I also used 2 other textbooks, Temple and Norton.
And did you review both of the books at issue here, Hank the Cowdog and Old Blue?
Yes, I did.
And were you able to come to an opinion to a reasonable degree of professional certainty as to whether the books were similar?
Yes, I was.
Now, tell us what your opinion was.
My opinion is that they are very similar.
Okay. And you said that you used these 6 different elements of literature to come to that opinion, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I want to go through each of those with you. So let's talk first about the plot. Can you just briefly describe to the members of the jury what a plot is, and to me too, truthfully?
Well, the plot is what takes place in the story. What is the action? In both books, we have the cow dogs protecting the ranch, director of ranch land security, and the biggest enemy out there is the coyotes. And we see both dogs overall protecting the ranch from the coyotes.
Would you say that Hank and Old Blue, in your opinion, their plot is substantially similar?
Yes, I would.
Now, how about the characters in the book? Tell me, when you're looking at literary characters, what are you looking at specifically?
First of all, you want the characters to be relatable. And in this case, we want them to be relatable to 8, 9, 10-year-old children. So in these particular books, the characters are dogs. The main characters are dogs. Each dog has a sidekick. Each dog has an owner, or at least the ranch hand, who seems to be responsible for him, and that ranch hand has a wife. The enemies, of course, are the coyotes. Very similar characters.
And in your professional opinion, you would say then that in Hank and Old Blue, the characters are substantially similar?
Yes, I would.
All right, now setting. What are we looking at when we're looking at 2 books and trying to determine if the setting is the same?
We're looking at both time and place. And Old Blue is more specific. Old Blue takes place, it says in there, on the Bosque River in central Texas. Hank does not say in Texas. He does refer to a county, Okeechobee County, and I know there's one in the panhandle of Texas, but the settings are described in so much the same way. The same western setting, the cactus, the tumbleweeds, the chalk bluffs or cliffs, the coyotes, the chickens on the ranch. The ranches are described much the same way. The time period is much the same. They're driving, in both things, they're driving cars. They're not always on horseback, driving pickup trucks. The setting just seems to be very much the same.
So in your opinion, in your professional opinion, would it be fair to say that the setting in Hank and Old Blue are substantially similar?
Yes.
All right, now theme. Tell us from your experience in literature, what exactly is a theme, and when you're looking for similar themes, what are you looking at?
Theme is the hardest thing to teach children because you have to think about what children bring to the experience of reading the book. That impacts the theme. But it's the message that the children leave with or the reader gets from the book. In all three of these books, the themes are survival, how do we fight against our enemies. I'm
going to stop you there for just 1 second. You said in all three of these books.
I mean,
so
all
you
two
just,
books,
okay,
I'm so sorry.
All right.
In these two books, the theme is survival, fighting against the enemy. It's of responsibility or attention to duty. Both main character dogs take it as their responsibility to do this job.
In your professional opinion, would the theme of Hank and Old Blue be substantially similar?
Yes, they would.
All right, now style. How is style different than theme?
Style is really to verbal style. What are the words used? What are the sentence structures used? What are the phrases? And I think probably this is one of the most similar of the 6 literary elements. My favorite example of style is the description of the town dogs, because in both books, the main characters talk about the town dogs, where they get their toenails painted, and they get baths, and they smell like, in one book it says parfume, the other one says perfume. But I just think the use of words, the verbal style, is very similar.
I'm going to show you a clip from Hank the Cow Dog and a clip from Old Blue. The Hank the Cow Dog is what you're going to see here on the left of the screen, and that is on page 58 of Exhibit 1. And then on page 39 of Exhibit 2, which is Old Blue, we see that on the right of the screen. Is this what you're referring to when you talk about the scene of the town dogs?
Yes, that's exactly.
And can you read to us what it says in that first screen?
And I never had no desire to be one of those town dogs that get their hair clipped and their toenails painted and get sprayed all over with that stinking perfume stuff. Perfume gives me a headache.
And what does the second clip say to the right?
You could be a perfect town dog that gets his hair clipped, toenails painted pink, and sprayed all over with perfume until he don't even smell like a real dog.
Now, other than this example, do you have other examples of where the verbal style is similar in Hank and Old Blue?
Yes, in both books, the main character talks directly to the audience. He says things like, "Don't you see?" or "Don't you know?" When they describe the dog food, in both books, the dog food is described as cheap, tasting like soap or liquid detergent, tasting or made out of sawdust or looking like sawdust. I think that this verbal style is very similar.
Now, I'm going to show you a clip from Hank the Cow Dog, page 19, Exhibit 1. Is this what you're referring to when you talk about the dog food?
Yes, it goes on down. There's more to it, but that's the main line.
pull up
Co-op
the-
food is
no,
the cheapest
don't have
food
that.
you can buy.
Okay. And then in Old Blue, you said he talks about dog food as well. Is that right?
He does. He calls it discount store food, but he talks about it being cheap, and it tastes like cardboard sprinkled with sawdust. The rest of it goes. Sometimes it also has a taste of liquid detergent.
And are there any other similarities related to the verbal style that you can think of?
I can't think of anything right now.
If there were mispronunciations or spelling problems in a book, What category would that fit in?
Well, that would fit in this category, and that's a good point, because both dogs mispronounce things and they misspell things, and they talk about not being good spellers, but you can't be a good speller and a good narrator too, and they think that gives them justification.
Now, in your opinion, is the style in Hank and Old Blue, the verbal style, substantially similar?
Yes, it is.
Now, the last category, illustrations. What are you looking at when you're looking at illustrations?
When we teach teachers, we're looking at asking them to help kids really look at the pictures, because for many children, that's the first step into reading. Let me see if this picture looks interesting, then I might want to read the text. So we look at, first of all, how did the illustrator create this picture? And in both books, it looks like they have used pen and ink. I'm not an artist, I don't know for sure, but I think it's pen and ink drawings. We look at what is the illustrator's or the artist's style. Both of them, to me, seem to be, in my opinion, more cartoonish than, say, impressionistic or something like that.
In your professional opinion, would the illustrations of Hank and Old Blue, based on what you teach your students and teachers, be substantially similar?
Yes.
Your Honor, pass the witness and permission to preserve this for my use.
I'm sorry?
Permission to preserve this for my use, Your Honor.
Yes, you may.
And I'm passing the witness at this
All
time.
right. Cross-exam.
Excuse me, sorry about that. Hi, Ms. Cox.
Hello.
Your Honor, permission to proceed?
Yes, you may.
Ms. Cox, you're a big fan of Mr. Erickson, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
You've been following his books for quite a long time.
I just know of his books. I used them in my classes. I've used them with my own 3 sons growing up. I used them when I was teaching.
That's right. You read Mr. Erickson's books at home and at work. Isn't
True.
that right? Mm-hmm. And you teach other teachers to use Mr. Erickson's book
I
at
do.
school. In fact, you attend major events so that you can see Mr. Erickson speak.
Well, I attend major events. I don't know that I would say it's just to see him, but I did see him on one occasion.
In fact, you waited in line at that one occasion just to get a chance to meet John Erickson.
Just to get a chance to get my book signed.
So you got your book signed and met him at
Right.
the same time?
Right.
Well, you mentioned a few characterizations, a few tools you use to analyze literature. I'd like to go through those with you. You started with character.
Yes.
When you read those 2 books, you characterized Old Blue as having a bully mentality, isn't that right?
I think he's more of a bully than Hank. I think there are cases where Hank is somewhat of a bully over Drover. So I think bullying is a theme that children can relate to. So I think you see a little bit of that in both books.
But you did classify Old Hank as a bully? Excuse me, Old Blue as a bully.
I said Old Blue is more of a bully than Hank.
And Old Blue is more of a prankster than Hank, too.
There seemed to be emphasis in the book on the fact that he was getting even with his owner. I didn't see that with Hank. There are pranks, but Hank is usually the victim of the pranks, but there are pranks in both books.
So the difference between who is doing the pranks, that's a difference in the 2 books.
I think there are just pranks in both books. I don't think that there's that much difference.
You've read Hank #1 specifically, isn't that right?
Yes, I have.
And Hank #1 is a mystery book, right?
Are you asking me the genre?
In your opinion, as a children's book expert, Hank is a mystery book, isn't that right?
No. Hank is a fantasy book. There are some mystery plots or subplots in there, but it is not. It's classified as a fantasy book. The animals are talking. That's what makes it fantasy.
The fact that the animals are talking are the one thing that makes it a fantasy book?
Well, and things that happen are believable, but you know in your heart they really couldn't happen in real life, but they're very believable. The author is good enough to make them believable. That's fantasy.
Let's take a look at the very first page of Hank the Cowdog. Your Honor, permission to approach with Exhibit 1.
Yes, you may.
If you could open that up to the first page and read to me the title of chapter 1. That's bloody murder, isn't it?
Yes, it says bloody murder. Kids love that.
Well, in chapter 1, Hank goes on to describe a murder on the farm.
Yes, he talks, no, it's on a ranch. There's a
Ranch,
difference
excuse
in a
me,
farm and a
excuse
ranch.
me.
There's been a murder on the ranch, he says.
Murder of a chicken, right?
He doesn't say that, but yes, that's right.
And he goes through trying to solve the murder of the chicken,
Yes, he does.
trying to solve the mystery of who murdered the chicken.
Like I say, there are mystery elements in the book, but it's classified as a fantasy.
In the book of Old Blue, you didn't see any reference to a murder, did you?
No.
You didn't see any reference to solving a mystery, did you?
They were just they were protecting from the coyotes.
Now, you talked about setting on direct examination. There are plenty of settings that are shared between different children's books, isn't that right?
Yes, that's true.
Certain settings are fairly common in the children's book industry.
Yes,
Ranches are one of those common settings.
yes.
You also talked about different word choice in the two books, but you know that when a dialect matches a setting, it's common to include that dialect in the book. Isn't that right?
Yes, it's common to include that, but I don't know why the settings were that much alike.
Well, the dialect may match the settings, and that's common in children's books. Isn't that right?
There's not as much dialect in children's books for this young age as you would think.
I don't want to talk about the age that the books are focused on, just what's common in children's books generally, and choosing dialect is common.
For older children's books, yes, I would agree.
There's also word choice. Word choice matches the setting in certain children's books, isn't that right?
I'm not sure what you mean. What words are you talking about? What do you mean by word choice?
In children's books, it's common to select words that would be used in a dialect that matches the setting.
Yes,
Same with slang words, isn't that right?
yes,
You also talked about the point of view on direct examination. Hank and Old Blue, they're both first-person point of view.
they are.
First-person point of view is a pretty common point of view for children's
Oh,
books.
very common in children's books, especially books for younger children.
Now, when you were reviewing these two books, you mentioned you used some tools, some textbooks, isn't that right?
I did,
You also used your experience in the children's book field.
I did,
You also made a few assumptions, didn't you?
I did. I call them educated assumptions.
Educated assumptions, excuse me.
Okay.
Now, whenever you saw something in Old Blue that you felt was similar to Hank, you assumed it was copied from Hank. Isn't that right?
At first, no. But yes, as I got through more and more through the book, I assumed this just sounds so much like Hank.
So, as you reached your conclusion, you made an educated assumption that anything in common between Old Blue and Hank was stolen from Hank.
I made an assumption that there were many similar things in the two books. I wouldn't say anything, but I would say many.
This isn't the first time you've testified, is it?
Pardon me?
You gave a deposition in this case,
Oh,
isn't
yes, I
that
did.
right?
Yes, I did.
And when you gave that deposition, you took an oath to be truthful.
I did.
You took an oath to be complete. You had a chance to review that deposition,
I did.
and after you reviewed it, you signed it. Isn't that right?
I did.
Your Honor, permission to approach with this witness's
Yes,
deposition.
ma'am.
Please excuse my tabs. This is the deposition you gave, correct?
Yes.
Taking a look, that's page 38.
Okay.
When you were asked about the assumptions that you made, the educated assumptions that you made, you said, you were asked, and to be clear, you're making the assumption that the author of Old Blue has mimicked the author of Hank. Your response, I'm making the educated assumption, yes. Those are your words.
Yes, they are. you did not use the word mimic, but yes, that, I mean, when you asked me the question, but I do think they mimicked it.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Redirect.
Your Honor, permission to approach and retrieve.
Yes, you may.
Thank you.
Ms. Cox, had you ever met Ms. Meyers before this litigation?
No, I still haven't met Ms.
You
Myers.
still haven't met Ms. Myers?
Right,
And had you ever met Bluff Creek Publishing?
no.
Objection, Your Honor, relevance.
Your Honor, if you'll just give me a moment of leeway, the relevance is here.
All right, proceed.
So you wouldn't be able to say with absolute certainty what Ms. Myers was thinking or doing when she wrote Old Blue, would you?
No.
And you wouldn't be able to say to this jury with absolute certainty that Bluff Creek Publishing had told Ms. Myers to copy the book either, would you?
No.
So when you had to give an opinion...
Objection, Your Honor. These are both leading and outside this expertise. They're improper opinions.
If I may
Objection.
respond, Your Honor. Oh, sorry.
Objection sustained as to leading.
Now, when you were just asked on cross-examination about your assumptions, why did you have to make assumptions, educated assumptions, as to whether the book was actually copied?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Why did you have to make an educated assumption as to the fact whether the book was actually copied?
Because that was the question I was asked. Did I think the material was similar?
But why weren't you able to say with absolute certainty? Were you able to say with certainty?
I think I was.
No more questions, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cox.
All right, any recalls?
Nothing further, Your
All
Honor.
right, you may sit down.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, who will plaintiff's next witness be?
Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiffs rest.
All right, very well. Is the defendant ready to proceed with their case?
Yes, Your Honor. Before proceeding, we ask to be heard outside the presence of the jury.
All right, we're constructively outside the presence. You may proceed.
Your Honor, under Rule 50 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, we move for a judgment as a matter of law. The plaintiffs had the burden today to prove not only that there were substantial similarities between the two books, but that the defendant had a hand in encouraging those similarities. They have showed absolutely no evidence that the defendant influenced Ms. Myers in her creation of Old Blue. Furthermore, Your Honor, they have failed to show that the similarities between the two books could only be reasonably explained by copying.
Okay, response?
Yes, Your Honor. As to the no evidence being submitted today to show that Bluff Creek Publishing knew or induced Ms. Myers to copy the work, we have testimony today from Mr. Erickson and Mr. Rinker that they gave a copy of the Hank the Cowdog book to Bluff Creek Publishing. And Your Honor, I believe that when Bluff Creek Publishing takes the stand, they will also admit that they did in fact give that book to Ms. Myers on the day that Ms. Myers signed the contract with Bluff Creek Publishing.
May I be heard on that point?
Your Honor, viewing the evidence in the light most favorable to the non-moving party, us, we have sufficiently shown by the giving of the book from Hank the Cowdog, Maverick Books, to Bluff Creek Publishing that they did induce Ms. Myers when they gave that book to Ms. Myers. Additionally, Your Honor, as far as showing that they knew or should have known it was a copy, their name is on the inside of the book, Bluff Creek Publishing. This is their work. By publishing this book, they are required to know what's inside the book. They are familiar with Hank the Cowdog, and Your Honor, we will again be able to establish this further and when we call when Bluff Creek Publishing is called to the stand. But at this point in time, we do believe that we have submitted sufficient evidence.
May I be heard on that, Your
Yes,
Honor?
ma'am.
The plaintiff is not entitled to rely upon the defendant's case in chief in overcoming a judgment as a matter of law. The plaintiff has the burden to establish their case, and the plaintiff has failed to produce any evidence that the books sent to Bluff Creek Publishing were ever given to Ms. Myers. Your Honor, that is a logical leap that is not within the light most favorable to the plaintiff standard.
Your Honor, if I may briefly respond to that. Even if we don't show the inducement, Your Honor, there is a second source that we can rely on, which would be the vicarious liability, and that would be that Bluff Creek Publishing would profit from Old Blue in that they are the publishers of the book. Now, by showing that they would profit if there has been a copyright, we establish the vicarious liability and don't need to worry about the inducement. As far as the substantial similarities, Bluff Creek Publishing should be aware of the substantial similarities between Hank the Cowdog and Old Blue. Therefore, we have met each of the elements of our cause of action without even having to rely on anything that the defense will produce during their case in chief.
Do you have any evidence other than the giving of the book with regard to inducement?
Your Honor, at this point in time, we do not at halftime. However, we do not need to rely on that. We can rely on either 3 or 4 of the jury instructions. So if we exclude contributory infringement at this point in time, Your Honor, we can still rely on vicarious infringement in order to meet the elements of our cause of action. Now, we have provided sufficient evidence for vicarious infringement.
Okay. Final word.
Yes, Your Honor. First, there is no evidence in the record that Bluff Creek Publishing would profit off of the sale of the Old Blue books. It's not a fair assumption to make without having evidence on the record when it is the plaintiff's burden to produce that evidence in establishing the case. Furthermore, Your Honor, mid-trial is the time to evaluate the plaintiff's evidence as it is, rather than making promises for evidence that might come out further in the trial.
All right. At this time, the motion for judgment as a matter of law is overruled, but without prejudice to re-urging it at another time. All right. All right. Who will defend its first witness be?
Your Honor, the defendant calls Rosie Meyers to the stand.
All right. Anyone need a break? Is the jury okay? Everybody all right? All right. Rosie Meyers.
Your Honor, before proceeding with the case in chief, may we check with the bailiff for the remaining time?
Yes, you may.
Yes, the plaintiffs have used 42 minutes and 8 seconds. The defense has used 28 minutes and 12 seconds.
Thank you.
All right. Where is Ms. Myers? Okay. I want to compliment the jury. You've been very attentive. I've noticed no one has fallen asleep. You've taken good notes over there. So I think we have a good jury in the box. Myers, please have a seat. All right, counsel, you may proceed.
Ms. Myers.
Hi.
Did you copy any parts of Hank the Cowdog when writing your book, Old Blue?
No, absolutely not.
We'll talk about that a little bit more, but first, I want to know about you. Where are you from?
I'm from Beaumont, Texas, which is down in southeast Texas.
What do you do for a living?
I am in human resources at Memorial Hermann Baptist Hospital down in Beaumont.
Can you tell us a little bit about your family?
Sure. I have 2 children. They're grown now. Amy is 20 and Michael is 25, so he's finished college now and she's getting close to the end.
Are you married?
Not anymore. I've been divorced for about 15 years.
Now, we're here talking about books. Are you a published author?
I am now, finally, yes.
And what book did you write?
Old Blue.
When did you first decide you wanted to try to be a published author?
Well, I wanted to be a writer since I was younger, even when I was in college. I always had a dream of being able to have a published book one day. But sometimes, kind of practicalities come into the mix and you don't get to always chase your dreams. So finally, just a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to go ahead and submit a chapter and see if I could find somebody who was interested.
Let's talk about that chapter you submitted. What was it called?
The dog's name was Tumbler. And it was one chapter of a book about this dog who was on a chicken farm.
Is it a children's book?
It is a children's book, yes.
Tell us a little bit about Tumbler's life on a chicken farm.
Well, Tumbler had a job on the chicken farm that was very important. He was supposed to chase off all the varmints that would come and try to get the chickens. And so he would chase off all the skunks and the raccoons that were in the area because it was set in East Texas because that's where my grandfather lived. So
You mentioned your grandfather. Did you spend time on a chicken farm?
I did actually. I grew up in Beaumont, but my grandfather had a chicken farm in Shelby County. And so in the summers, I would go spend time with him and I'd help feed the chickens and just go out and play on the farm.
Was there a dog on that farm?
Yes, Pete. That was my grandfather's dog.
Was Pete a pet or a working dog?
He was a working dog. I mean, he was a family friend, but his role was to help look after the chickens and to chase off all the varmints. That's where Tumbler came from.
You mentioned you submitted Tumblr. Who did you submit it to?
To Mr. Scurry. He was a publisher. I did some research, and I found out about a publishing company who was interested in promoting Texas authors. So I thought maybe this might be my opportunity to find somebody who'd be interested.
How did you submit it to Mr. Scurry?
I sent him an email and then sent him that chapter that I had written.
Did you and Mr. Scurry correspond via email?
Yes, we had a few email exchanges and then eventually talked by phone.
Permission to approach with Exhibits 16 and 17.
Yes, you may.
Ms. Myers, what did I just hand you?
These are printouts of some emails between Mr. Scurry and myself.
Let's start with Exhibit 16.
Okay.
What is the date at the top of that email?
The very top part is August 2nd of 2012.
Who is it sent from?
It's from William Scurry.
And who is it sent to?
It's sent to me.
Is the email address listed on that email your correct email address?
Yes, rmyers@yahoo.com. That's mine.
Your Honor, I offer Exhibit 16.
Your Honor, I object to the admissibility of this document. It is inadmissible hearsay, subject to no exception.
Objection to overrule.
Let's take a look at Exhibit 16.
Okay.
What is Mr. Scurry saying to you in this?
The top part where he's responding to me, he's thanking me for my submission that I had sent in, and he thought that it had a lot of promise, so I was of course excited to hear that. But he thought that he would like to see a few changes, so that way this would kind of appeal to more people than what I had written. He didn't really like the chicken farm idea. He thought that a cattle ranch might be something more appealing, and chicken farm is kind of odd, but that was my experience. So he was just giving some thoughts about, he was interested, but he thought some changes might be warranted. So,
How did you react to his comments about a chicken farm?
well, after I thought about it, it kind of made sense. I mean, I wrote it in the setting that I did because that's what I knew about, but I don't really see children getting too excited about chickens like they do about horses and cows and things like that. So I thought it sounded like a reasonable suggestion.
In writing your book, were you interested in reaching a wider audience?
Well, sure. I mean, if you want to be an author and you want to be an author that children, tell their parents, hey, Mom and Dad, the next book is coming out, you want as many kids to be as interested as possible.
Did Mr. Scurry give you any other suggestions about reaching a wider audience?
Yes, we had talked about the dog maybe being a little bit different in that, if we had a dog that maybe had roots in the city and came to the country, then that might bring in some kids who were more city-oriented but could have some connection to the dog that was the main character in the story.
How did Mr. Scurry communicate those suggestions to you?
In email, and then I had called him at one point and left him a message kind of telling him I had thought things over. And
Let's
what
talk
I thought.
about the email first.
Okay.
Is that Exhibit 17?
Let's see. Yes, this is an email from him back to me again.
And is that with your same accurate email address?
Yes, at yahoo.com, yes.
I offer Exhibit 17, Your Honor.
Any objection?
Just, Your Honor, that it's inadmissible hearsay.
Objections overruled. Proceed.
Let's start with the second paragraph of that email.
Okay.
What suggestions is Mr. Scurry making in that second paragraph?
Oh, okay. Well, this went along with the idea that we were going to change it from East Texas, where my family was from, to more of a Central Texas cattle type area. And in East Texas, the kind of animals, the varmints you had to worry about were the skunks and raccoons and things. And he thought, well, if we were moving the location, that we need to deal with different types of critters to be out there and disturbing the animals. And so he suggested some things like wild hogs and coyotes and different types of animals that you'd see in a different location.
Did you make that change?
Sure, I mean, it made sense. If we were moving the location, the nature of the animals that you'd run into would be different as well, so it seemed reasonable.
Let's take a look at that first paragraph there.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier he says something about city kids.
Yes.
What change did you make to your story about city kids?
Well, what I ended up doing was Old Blue had been a dog in an urban area, but it didn't work out so well because he made a lot of racket, and his owners realized that he wasn't really fit for the city, so they sent him to the farm. So that way we had a tie-in to an urban setting, but then transport it to the farm, so maybe we could get some of those kids interested who weren't that familiar with rural life.
We also see there that Mr. Scurry says something about a family dynamic.
Yes.
What is he talking about there?
Well, I had a different kind of background and perspective because I had been a single mother for so many years. And raising my kids, when I got divorced, my daughter was 6 and my son was about to be 11. And my ex-husband really didn't tow his weight. And so it was pretty much me and the kids. And I encountered a lot when, my kids were growing up, that TV shows, books that were about this, perfect nuclear family, they didn't really relate to, and oftentimes it made them feel bad and different, like, why don't I have that? And so the idea of maybe having some different type of family dynamics might help those kids who don't really have anything else to relate to.
Did you incorporate that in your book?
Yes, a little bit, yes.
Now, I want to ask, did you reference any other children's books when you were writing Old Blue?
Reference any? I mean, Old Blue is what I wrote. I mean, it's mine.
Did you read any other children's books while you were writing Old Blue?
Like just to read or to compare to, I guess?
Well, did Mr. Scurry give you a book while you were writing Old Blue?
Oh, he gave me, it was one of the Hank books. I think it's one of the later Hank books in the series.
Did Mr. Scurry ask you to copy it?
No. It was to kind of we had talked about that we wanted these books to be very different. We didn't want it to be like other books that were out there. So I took a look at, I sort of read it. It didn't really appeal to me very much. I kind of went through it a little bit just to kind of see the perspective that those books came from and what was involved there. But that was really the point of it.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
All right. Cross-exam?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Ms. Meyers.
Hi.
I'm Sherry Mazer on behalf of the plaintiff, Mr. Erickson. I'm going to have to ask you a few questions about the book that you wrote, Old
Sure.
Blue.
Okay.
Now, you did write Old Blue, correct?
I did.
And this was your very first book, wasn't it?
It is.
Before Old Blue, you hadn't written a book at all.
No, I
Hadn't
haven't written any
published a
books.
book,
No.
but you really wanted to.
Yes.
It was one of your dreams.
It has been, yes.
Now, prior to Old Blue, you hadn't, not just had you not written a book, but you actually hadn't published anything, had you?
Published, no.
And the most you had done was written a short story or two.
Yes.
And these short stories, they were about 2 or 3 pages at the most.
Right.
But all of a sudden, Old Blue came along. Well, it was Tumblr first, wasn't it?
Yes, the chapter I submitted was Tumblr, was the name of that dog.
But Tumblr didn't stick, did it?
No.
In fact, Tumblr became Old Blue.
Yes, it did.
And it became Old Blue after you signed a deal with Bluff Creek Publishing.
Right, with Mr. Scurry, yes.
Now, after you signed the deal with Bluff Creek Publishing, that's also when you moved Old Blue, or Tumblr, Old Blue, your old dog, from East Texas to Central Texas, right?
Right.
And that was because Mr. Scurry told you to, from Bluff Creek Publishing.
Well, he thought it was a good idea, and I agreed, yes.
And you agreed, so you changed it, right? And that's when you also had your dog change the name from Tumblr to Old Blue.
Yes.
And that's also when you decided that Old Blue would be the director of ranchland security, right?
Yes.
Because your old book, Tumblr, the book you had submitted to Bluff Creek Publishing, you didn't have a director of security in that book, did you?
Well, it wasn't a whole book yet. It was a chapter. It was just getting some work out there to see if somebody liked the idea. It was just
Well,
a chapter.
Let's talk about the fact that it was just a chapter.
Right.
Because when you signed the contract with Bluff Creek Publishing, you didn't have even an outline written for the rest of your book, did you?
Probably not at that time, no.
You didn't even have notes written for the rest of your book, did you?
No.
You had about 7 pages?
I thought it was a little bit longer than that, but it was one chapter.
1 chapter?
Yes.
But then Bluff Creek Publishing, they handed you a book, didn't they?
They handed me a book.
Well, they gave you Hank the Cowdog, didn't they?
I don't think it was that one. I don't know. It was the one later on in the series. I don't know which one it was. It was Big Question or something, I think.
So they gave you a book,
Uh-huh.
a Hank the Cowdog book.
Yes.
And now, the people that gave it to you, it was Bluff Creek Publishing, right?
Yes, it came from Mr. Scurry, yes.
Mr. Scurry gave you the book,
Mm-hmm.
and you read it, right?
Sort of, yes.
And that wasn't the first time that you had read a Hank the Cowdog book either, was it?
No, I had tried to read one of them to my son.
And that was several years ago.
Yeah, it was back in the 90s at some point when he was a little kid.
So it's fair to say that you were familiar with the Hank the Cowdog stories, at least some of them, right?
I knew that it existed and it was about a dog, but frankly, they didn't really appeal to me or my son. We didn't find them that interesting, so we kind of dropped that.
Now, after you received the Hank the Cowdog book and you looked over the Hank the Cowdog book, you sat down to write your book, didn't you?
Well, yeah, it would have been after I looked at it, sure. After I had already done one chapter, too.
And that's when you finished the rest of Old Blue, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And now in Old Blue, you have a story about a coyote, right?
Well, Old Blue is not all about a coyote. It's mainly about the dog and the other dog that lives on the farm. There's a coyote in it, yes.
It'd be fair to say that the main event in your book is about a coyote raid, right?
The big event, yes.
And this coyote raid, it ends up where these coyotes are on the ranch and the cowboy comes out to deal with those coyotes, right?
Yes, Buck.
And the story ends by Buck dealing with those coyotes by firing a buckshot at the coyotes, right?
Sure.
And then the coyotes scatter.
Yes.
Now, if I were to tell you that Hank the Cowdog has the same climax in his book, the same coyote raid, would that surprise you?
Not really.
And what if I was to tell you that at the end of the book, a cowboy comes out and fires a shot, a buckshot? Would that surprise you?
No.
And then the coyotes scatter.
Not surprising.
Now, you're claiming that you didn't copy Hank the Cowdog, right?
No, I did not.
But now, Hank the Cowdog, he is the head of ranch security. Can we agree on that?
I don't think he's called the same thing.
Okay, right now I'm going to show you a clip from what's already been entered into evidence as Exhibit 1. This is page 2 of Hank the Cowdog. And this is Hank saying he's head of ranch security.
Okay.
Would you agree with that?
That's what it says, yes.
All right, now I'm going to show you your book, page 3, where you describe Blue as director of ranchland security. Is
Yes,
that right?
Director of Ranchland Security, kind of like Department of Homeland Security, Director of Ranchland Security. It's supposed to kind of tie into modern times.
And now you claim that you didn't copy Hank the Cowdog.
No, I didn't copy Hank the Cowdog.
All right. Now I'm going to show you page 23 of Exhibit 1, Hank the Cowdog. Sorry. The Stronger, Braver. Page 23. Hank describes dogs on the ranch as having to be stronger, braver, and tougher than any brand of dog in the world. Would you agree with that?
That's what it says.
Now I'm going to show you page 39 of your book. Blue says we have to be stronger, braver, and tougher, and more diligent than ordinary dogs. Is that right?
That's what it says.
But you claim that you didn't copy Hank the Cowdog.
I did not copy Hank the Cowdog.
All right, now I'm going to show you page 58, where Hank talks about town dogs having painted toenails. He says they get their hair clipped, their toenails painted, and talks about perfume getting sprayed on them. Would you agree that that's what that says?
It is what it says.
Now I'm going to show you page 39 of your book, and you say town dogs get their hair clipped, toenails painted pink, and sprayed all over with perfume. Did I read that right?
You did.
But you claim that you didn't copy Hank the Cowdog?
I did not copy Hank the Cowdog.
All right. Now I want to show you page 31 of Hank the Cowdog. He talks about having a dipstick, and it gets wiped off on his ear. The stick gets pulled out from under the hood of a car. Can we agree that it says that?
It does.
Now I'm going to show you page 7 of your book. You talk about pulls out the Pickup's oil dipstick and wipes it over my back. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm.
And you claim that you didn't copy Hank the Cowdog.
I didn't copy Hank the Cowdog. It's not that I claim it. I didn't copy Hank the Cowdog.
Pass the witness.
All right, thank you. Rita Ray.
Yes, Your Honor. One moment, please.
All right, we're going to take about a 5-minute recess. They need to make an adjustment to the microphones, and we'll take a short break, and then we'll come back and conclude. Be in recess.
All rise.
Please be seated. Ms. Myers, you may take witness stand. I believe, counsel, you were going to redirect.
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Now, Ms. Myers, opposing counsel was asking you a little bit about the different titles of the two dogs in Hank and Old Blue. Let's take a look at page 3 of Old Blue, Exhibit 2.
Okay.
Come up on your monitor there. This is a paragraph. Could you read that highlighted section at the top?
Yes, I am an expert in counter-coyote-terrorism.
And how about that line at the bottom that's highlighted?
My job as Director of Ranchland Security.
Now, on cross-examination, you mentioned that Director of Ranchland Security sounds a lot like a position in the U.S. government.
Exactly.
Which position is that?
The Director of the Department of Homeland Security.
And what does the Director of the Department of Homeland Security fight against?
Terrorism, so it's counterterrorism operations. So, I mean, that's kind of a more modern twist on, you know, types of activities that kids might be familiar with.
Now, Ms. Mazur also asked you on cross-examination if you would be surprised to learn that the two books about talking dogs on a ranch protecting against coyotes had some common elements.
Right.
Why doesn't that surprise you?
Well, in my experience with being on farms and things like that, and when, I mean, you do research to write books, so when I had to get a little bit more familiar with cattle ranching, if you are trying to protect animals and you're a cowboy in Texas, you're going to have a shotgun, so you're going to fire buckshot, and guess what? If you fire buckshot at animals, they're going to run and scatter. So it kind of makes sense that if you have two different books that are both set on farms that involve cowboys, that's going to be a common scenario that would occur. So frankly, that doesn't surprise me.
Now, looking back to the character and behavior of dogs, you mentioned you knew a dog on your grandpa's farm?
Yes, Pete.
Would you call that a typical dog?
Pretty much, yeah.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Any recross?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, Ms. Myers. You may step down.
Thanks.
All right, who will be your next witness, counsel?
Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Maura Shortener to the stand.
All right, doctor.
I need Shortener's everything. May I
You may
proceed?
proceed.
Good afternoon, Dr. Jordan.
Hi,
Please introduce yourself to the jury.
sure. Hi, my name is Dr. Maura Shortener. I teach literature at Penn State University.
Now, Dr. Jordan, Dr. Jortner, are you prepared to give a conclusion today, an opinion about whether Old Blue is probatively similar to Hank the Cow Dog?
I am prepared. It is not probatively.
Before we get to your conclusion, let's talk about what qualifies you to give that opinion.
Sure.
You mentioned you're a lecturer at Penn State University.
Yes,
Are you? What do you lecture in?
literature.
What is your education?
I have a bachelor's from Franciscan University in literature. I have a master's from Xavier University, also in literature, and I have a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh.
You mentioned you're a lecturer in literature. Is there any particular class you lecture on?
Yes, I teach both American literature and British literature.
Do you-
I also teach 2 sections of freshman writing. Not creative writing, composition.
What is the difference between creative writing and composition?
Creative writing is like writing books or writing novels, or in composition, students are going to be asked to write college essays. It's just a completely different mindset. They're going to be asked to do research and to argue a point.
The other classes you mentioned, are they about creative writing or composition writing?
I'm sorry, the literature classes?
Yes.
The literature classes are about reading different texts within the established canon and how to respond to that.
Now, before you came to your conclusions today, did you look at the two books, Hank the Cowdog and Old Blue?
I did.
Did you apply your knowledge from the literary field in analyzing those two books?
I did.
What kinds of fields did you consider in comparing the different books? What kinds of literary tools? For example, plot or theme?
Okay, that's what you're looking for. Yes, I looked at plot, I looked at character, I looked at setting, I looked at pace, I looked at mood. The list was actually much longer than what Ms. Cox looked at. I think I considered 12 elements.
We'll talk about those 12 elements in just a moment. When you were considering whether the two books were probatively similar, what was the standard you applied for probative similarity?
I don't remember. Do you have are you looking for the legal language?
Well, just what you applied. Your Honor, permission to approach with this expert's report.
Yes, you may.
Looking at that report, read it to yourself silently and look up at me when you're done.
Oh, thank you.
Now explain to me in your own words what standard you used to determine if the two books were probatively similar.
I wanted to see whether or not Mrs. Meyers copied part of her work from the plaintiff's work. And I looked at similarities or differences between plot, themes, dialogue, mood, setting, pace, characters, and sequence of events.
Did you reach your conclusions today to a reasonable degree of professional certainty?
Yes.
Your Honor, I offer Dr. Shortener as an expert in American and English literature.
Right, you may proceed.
Thank you. You can set that aside. So, Dr. Shortener, what is your conclusion? Is Hank the Cowdog probatively similar to Old Blue?
I don't believe so.
Let's go through some of those tools you mentioned a moment ago, beginning with plot structure. Can you tell us what is the plot structure of Hank?
Hank follows a simple chronology. It starts at the beginning, where the mystery is introduced, and it ends basically when the mystery is solved. Old Blue has a very different plot structure. It includes a lot of flashbacks. We go back to hear about when Old Blue lived in the city and how he got to the ranch in the first place, and it's broken up. Many different chapters go back to Blue's past.
Let's talk about genre. How would you describe the genre of Hank the Cowdog?
I would say that this book is a mystery.
Why do you say that?
Well, I don't believe that it's a fantasy, even though dogs talk. It's a mystery because the very first thing that the reader encounters is that there's a murder on the ranch, and that Hank is trying to figure out who did it.
What about Old Blue? What genre is he?
Old Blue is an action-adventure. It's a suspense. We're waiting for those coyotes to attack. We know it's going to happen from the very beginning. There's no mystery about it. We're just waiting for that action.
You mentioned mood a little bit earlier. What is the mood of Hank the Cowdog?
Hank is very funny. Hank is an unreliable narrator. He's often a bumbling narrator. My 7.5-year-old, I've read Hank the Cowdog, the first book, to her, and she laughed hysterically at the chapter about the boxer when Hank and Drover pee on the tires. She can't get enough of it. Old Blue is substantially different in terms of mood. It's much darker and much scarier. I can say that I wouldn't read it to my daughter at this point in time.
Let's apply that mood to a specific instance in these books. We've heard a lot today that both of the books deal with coyotes. Is that a yes?
Yes.
How does Hank the Cowdog's interaction with the coyotes illustrate the mood of the book?
The coyotes in Hank the Cowdog are comic. They're dumb. They talk unintelligently. They get drunk. They eat rotten meat. They're funny. The first time he meets the coyote, Missy, or the coyote who he calls Missy, her head is stuck in a Hawaiian punch can, and she can't get it off. So
they're very funny. The coyotes in Old Blue are very scary.
How are they scary?
Could we look at a picture, or are you gonna?
It's not an illustration. I'm just asking about your reading of the
well,
book.
the coyotes in Old Blue are very frightening. When they attack, they're described as shadowy shapes. We barely see them, but we know that Old Blue is in real danger. He may be indeed killed at any moment.
Now, you also mentioned character. Are the characters, Hank the Cowdog and Old Blue, in and of themselves different?
I think so.
How so?
Well, they're two very different dogs, and I know that they're both dogs, and they're both talking dogs. But Hank, as I said, is bumbling, he's proud, he's comic, he's a very loyal dog, he really wants affection, he always wants his master to pet him. Old Blue is mischievous. Given the chance, he's gonna steal those eggs. He's also, I think, considers himself an equal to his owner, Buck. He's one of the cowboys on the ranch. He's a much more reliable narrator as well. He's not going to mistake a milk cow for a monster.
Let's look at an example of that in the Old Blue book and the Hank the Cowdog book. Do you remember reading passages about having a dipstick wiped on the dog?
I do.
Let's start with the Hank the Cowdog version of the dipstick story.
Sure.
Pop up there on your screen. Your Honor, permission to approach with the physical book.
All right.
It's Exhibit 1, Counsel page 31.
Thank you.
Ms. Shortener, if you could read to us beginning here and ending at that paragraph here.
Okay. But Slim didn't notice. He reached under the hood, pulled out the dipstick, and wiped it off of my ear. Good dog. And that was it. I waited around for some more scratching or handshaking, but he seemed to forget I was there. He slammed the hood and stepped on my paw. Oops, sorry, Hank. Get out of the way. The sweet moments in this life are fleeting. You have to enjoy them to the fullest when they come, but before some noodle steps on you and tells you to get out of the way.
Now let's take a look at a similar passage in Old Blue. You can set that aside. Permission to approach with a physical copy, Your Honor. If you could take a look here at page 7, reading from here, I should have, and ending all the way to he.
Okay.
Could you read that to us, please?
I should have been suspicious, but I dutifully trotted over to get my due and lend my sage wisdom. But Buck, feeling his lazy streak, pulls out the pickup's oil dipstick and wipes it over my back so he can check the oil without walking a few feet to get a rag out of the shed. Now there's gratitude for you. Here I stick with him through thick and thin, and he uses my fur for an oil rag. And does it under false pretenses, and worst, he chuckled when he did it.
Dr. Jortner, I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you skip the paragraph and start at the paragraph on the bottom of the page?
Certainly. With the now friends.
Yes.
Now, friends, it's not as if ranch hounds don't learn from their cowboys. Sometime when Buck least expect it, I will render swift justice for this dipstick depredation. I won't tell you when it's going to happen, but I'll make an announcement when this chicken has come home to roost. Watch close, and you might see it coming. Buck won't. Hee hee.
Thank you. You can set that aside. How do those two dipstick stories demonstrate the different characters of Hank and Old Blue?
I think it demonstrates it perfectly. Hank really wants his master to give him more praise, to keep calling him good dog. He's a very affectionate dog. Old Blue, on the other hand, wants to turn it around and get back at Buck. He's looking for a chance for revenge.
So, Dr. Jortner, considering the differences in plot structure, genre, mood, and character, In your professional opinion, are these two books probatively similar?
I don't believe they are.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Thank you. Cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. May I retrieve a demonstrative, Your Honor?
Permission to move, Your Honor, when she uses the demonstrative?
What's that?
Permission to move when opposing counsel
Yes, you
uses the
may.
demonstrative?
Good afternoon.
Hi.
My name is Sherry Mazer. I represent the plaintiff in this case, Mr. Erickson. I'm going to ask you a few questions about the opinion that you came to. But before we do, I want to talk to you about your credentials.
Sure.
Now, you listed quite a few things that you've done in your time in the field of literature.
Yes.
Isn't that right? And some of those, you gave lectures, wrote some articles, is that right?
Yes.
But now,
You're
none
speaking of the professional presentations when
That's
you
correct.
say
Your
lectures?
professional presentations, you've written some publications.
I have.
But none of those had to deal with children's literature, did they?
It's true, they did not.
And your degrees are in literature generally, not children's literature either, is that right?
That's correct.
And you don't teach children, do you?
I don't.
So you don't generally work with children's literature either, do you?
Just on a professional basis?
Correct.
That's correct.
Okay. But now, you came to an opinion in this case regarding two children's books, isn't that right?
I think my qualifications as a literary professor would be able to cross those bounds, but yes, that's correct.
It's correct that you came to an opinion in this case about children's books, right?
Yes.
Now, I want to talk to you about your opinion that these books aren't similar.
Sure.
Now, we're going to go through some of the similarities between Hank and Old Blue. Because you did read both books, correct?
I did.
All right. Now, in Hank, we have a scene with a cow dog, correct?
I'm sorry, you said we
Hank
have
is about a cow dog, right?
Sure.
A dog.
Sure.
Can we agree on that? Old Blue is about a dog, right?
Yeah.
Both of these dogs talk, right? They narrate
Yeah.
in the first person.
Sure.
Now, both of these dogs live on a ranch, right?
Yeah.
Hank lives in Texas.
You know, I was unclear about that from reading the Hank books.
We agree that Hank lives in the West.
I would agree to that.
And Old Blue, he lives in the West too, right?
Well, he specifically lives in Texas.
And
We
Texas
have-
would be in the Southwest, right?
Sure.
Can we agree that Texas is in the West?
I've always been told it depends on what part of Texas you're talking about. But sure,
Okay.
for this purpose, okay.
Now, in Hank, there's a neighbor dog that he's pretty interested in. Isn't that right?
It's true.
Maybe we could say that he has a girl. Would that be fair? Girl he likes.
There is, yes, if I'm not mistaken, is it a collie? I believe it's a collie that he likes.
So there's a girl dog. And can we agree that there's also a girl dog in Old Blue? A dog
I think it's mentioned once. It doesn't come up very much.
It is mentioned,
sure,
though,
it
that
is
there's a
mentioned.
dog in Old Blue, a female dog he's interested in, right?
Yeah.
Now, Hank has a sidekick, right? Drover.
Yes.
Old Blue has a sidekick.
I would not call Jake a sidekick. Jake he's teaching Jake. Jake is little more just after being a puppy. Drover, I would definitely categorize as a sidekick. When I think about a sidekick, I think about a comic character, someone who does things incorrectly. That's not really the case with Jake. He's doing things incorrectly, not out of being bumbling or misreading the situation. He's basically a puppy.
Okay. Now, in Hank, can we agree that Hank deals with a coyote raid?
Well, that's not the main action that Hank is dealing with.
Certainly there's a coyote raid.
There is a
in Hank.
coyote raid,
Okay.
sure.
And in Old Blue, there's a coyote raid, isn't there?
Yes, that's the main action.
And the story in Hank ends
Objection,
with...
Your Honor. At this point, to make sure the demonstrative accurately reflects the testimony of the witness, I ask that Counselor marks in one story, the coyote raid is the main action. In the other story, it is not, in order to avoid misleading the jury with this demonstrative.
Your Honor, if I may respond. The fact that there's a coyote raid was my question, not whether it was the main event in the book. So since I have asked if it's a coyote raid and the witness has agreed, I don't feel like the demonstrative needs to be any further than
Objections
this.
overruled. You can cover it on cross, counsel.
Now, we were talking a moment ago about some of the similarities. So in Hank, you would agree that the coyote raid ends with a gun being fired at the coyote, right?
Yeah,
Fired by a cowboy.
sure.
It'd be fair to state that as cowboy fires gun?
Sure.
Okay. And you would agree also that in Old Blue, a cowboy comes out and fires a gun at the coyotes to end the raid.
Sure.
Now, in Hank, I'm moving a little bit towards more style things now, and in Hank, you would agree that there are some common misspellings that he makes throughout the book, correct?
Sure. I don't know that that is only found in Hank, though. I think that's a device that we see through a lot of things for children.
Well, and it's not only found in Hank, because it's also found in Old Blue, isn't it?
Sure. And
There
if
are
we were,
misspellings, correct?
if we would get a transcript of, let's say, Bugs Bunny, we'd have misspellings too.
Well, we're not talking about Bugs Bunny right now. Specifically, I just want to ask you about Old Blue, and you would agree that there are misspellings in
Sure.
Old Blue, correct? And now you know that Hank, he likes to refer to the language of dogs, that it's a Latin root. Are you aware of that?
I would have to look up the specific reference. Do you have that?
I sure do.
Oh, great.
Now, in Hank the Cowdog, on page 69, he's referring to the language of dogs as Dogus domesticus and Dogus coyotus. Do you
What?
agree with that?
No, the modern Dogish is the language.
Right.
Isn't that correct? And then the species is, he's putting the Latin terms on those two.
And we can agree that he's trying to make it look as if it's Latin phraseology, correct?
About the difference in the species?
Correct.
Sure.
Okay. And now you are aware that in Old Blue, Miss Meyers does the same thing, aren't you?
About the difference in the species?
When she talks...
Again,
when
I don't have that, I read the books many times, but I don't have that reference memorized.
Well,
If
and you
have
are
it-
here giving an opinion, an expert opinion, as to the similarities or differences between the books, correct?
Absolutely. I remember this book saying, I believe dog Latin.
And do you also remember a point in time in Miss Myers
Oh,
where
there's
she
the dog
refers
Latin.
to it as Canis latrans?
I had forgotten that part.
So can we agree that both of them use Latin phraseology, at least in part in the book?
Sure, at least once.
Now, I want to talk to you about a few other specifics. You can pull up some side-by-sides in the books. I want to talk to you about a clip with a town dog and getting their toenails clipped. Do you remember that?
I do.
Okay, and do you remember reading that in Hank the Cowdog?
I remember seeing it at this trial today, seeing both of them put up.
And you saw those both, and you did consider these in coming to your expert opinion that the books weren't copied, didn't you?
I did.
Now, what about the clip about the how about the stronger, braver, and tougher? You saw both of these, too, during the trial today, then, as well.
I did. These are small details that, quite frankly, until this trial, I had not seen these two differences. I mean, we're talking about entire books
Now,
here.
Old Blue, it's about 50 pages, give or take, right? And in those 50 pages, you didn't notice the commonalities between this book, the specifics between this book and Hank, even though that's what you were hired to do?
I was not hired to find the similarities. I was hired to see, were they probatively similar or not, to see the similarities as well as the differences.
So you were hired to see the similarities and differences, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, you were hired by Bluff Creek Publishing to give an opinion, correct?
I was.
And it is true that you're trying to break into the book market as well, aren't you?
I am.
And in fact, you actually sent your manuscript to Bluff Creek Publishing, didn't you?
As well as some other small publishing houses and literary agents.
So that's a yes. You sent
Yes.
your manuscript to Bluff Creek Publishing.
Yes.
And now you're here today testifying for them.
Yes.
And they have not agreed yet as to whether or not they're going to accept your manuscript, have they?
They haven't.
Thank you. No more questions.
All right, thank you. Redirect?
And
Brief
Your Honor,
redirect, Your
permission
Honor.
to preserve this.
Yes, you may. Counsel will mark your two demonstratives as plaintiff's demonstratives 1 and 2.
Thank you, Your Honor.
May I proceed?
Yes, you may.
Ms. Myers, opposing counsel was just asking you a bit about your manuscript.
I'm Dr. Jordan.
Excuse me,
That's
Dr. Jordan.
Yes.
Opposing counsel was just asking you a bit about your manuscript. How many different publishing houses have you submitted your manuscript to?
I've submitted it to 3 different publishing houses and 10 literary agents.
And of those 10 literary agents and 3 publishing houses, have you heard back from anyone yet?
I have heard back a no from 5 literary agents, but I haven't heard back from any of the publishing houses.
Have you heard anything from Bluff Creek Publishing?
I have not yet.
Have they communicated in any way that today's testimony would affect their decision?
They have not.
Are you, do you rely upon income from publishing books?
No.
What do you rely on for your income?
From my university position.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. All right, you may step down. Who will be your next witness?
Your Honor, the defense calls William Scurry.
All right, Scurry.
Sorry, I know you had me
Thank
bad here.
May proceed. Good afternoon, Mr. Scurry.
Good afternoon.
Now, I want to learn a little bit about you today. Where do you live?
I live in Crawford, Texas.
What do you do for a living?
I'm the president and founder of Bluff Creek Publishers.
We've heard Bluff Creek a lot. Why did you decide to found it?
I have had some background in publishing. I was an English major in college. I did a thesis on the critique of children's literature. I also served an internship with the University of Texas Press and then spent some time with some academic presses. I wanted to come back to Texas, open up a publishing company, and feature and promote Texas authors.
Besides featuring and promoting Texas authors, did you have any intention to promote your work outside of Texas?
That was my goal, was to expose Texas authors and their work to a broader readership, to a broader market, to appeal to different cultures, different cities, different parts of the country.
Why did you choose to approach John Erickson about his books?
I loved the Hank the Cowdog books. I had read them to my son when he was young, and I knew that John Erickson was a Texas author, and I thought it would be a perfect fit for my publishing company.
Do the books have Texas flavor about them?
Yes.
You mentioned that you also wanted your books to have a wider reach. Does
Correct.
Hank have a wider reach?
Hank has more of a regional reach. It's more Texas. It's a traditional family. It's a traditional ranch. I think today's world is a little bit more modern family and a little less Leave It to Beaver.
Have you ever communicated those thoughts with Mr. Erickson?
Not directly with Mr. Erickson, but through Mr. Rinker, who worked for him.
And how did you communicate that to Mr. Rinker?
I believe it was by email. I had contacted Mr. Rinker. I knew that Mr. Erickson had another book that was in the works, and I thought maybe he would be willing to let us publish it. I communicated with Mr. Rinker, suggested to him that there were some changes that I thought that we could make that, in my opinion, at the time were minor changes, but to broaden the appeal of the books.
Did Mr. Erickson share your opinion that they were minor changes?
Mr. Erickson felt that they were major changes.
Did you ever create a relationship with Mr. Erickson?
Other than I understood where he came from, I thanked him for his time, and I moved on.
Who did you move on to?
I moved on to Ms. Myers, Rosie Meyers, who had previously queried me about a children's book that she had written.
Why Rosie Meyers?
Again, because she had submitted a chapter to me on it was a children's book about a dog named Tumbler. And so I got back in touch with her after Mr. Erickson turned me down.
Where was the setting of Tumbler?
Originally, as submitted to me, it was a chicken ranch or chicken farm in East Texas.
Did you, unlike Mr. Erickson, did Ms. Myers share your interest in reaching a broader audience?
She very much so did. She communicated to me that she was had a divorce, and so her children were from a single-parent home, and she certainly understood the trying to reach out to a broader audience, particularly with children, that it was important to them to have books and families and characters that they could identify with and relate to their situations.
Well, you mentioned a broader audience and different kinds of families. Did you suggest any changes about families in your children's books?
We bounced around some ideas, and in fact, in Old Blue, we have a couple living together who may or may not be married. So it's more modern family than it is Leave It to Beaver or Lassie.
We've also heard about some changes in setting. Why did you ask Ms. Myers to change the setting?
Even though we're going for a broader reach and a broader market beyond the borders of the Texas, when people outside the state think of Texas, they don't really think of chicken ranches in East Texas. And so I thought that it was more Texan to be a ranch, a cattle ranch, a cow ranch. I suggested moving it to the central Texas area around Crawford, which is where I grew up. I was familiar with ranches and farms and farm dogs and ranch dogs and cowboys and cowgirls.
Are there many ranches and farm dogs and cowboys and cowgirls in central Texas?
There are more than you can shake a stick at.
We also saw that you suggested Ms. Myers change her villain from a raccoon to maybe a coyote.
Yes.
Why did you make that suggestion?
That's sort of a storytelling thing, but I've learned as a storyteller that you sort of measure your protagonist by how strong the antagonist is, and quite frankly, being able to overcome raccoons didn't sound all that compelling to me, and so I thought that we would go with one of the more common and more predatory animals in central Texas, such as bobcats, feral pigs, coyotes.
When Ms. Myers was writing her book, Old Blue, did you send her anything to look at?
I did. I sent her copies of a couple of the Hank the Cowdog books.
Did you tell Ms. Myers to copy the Hank the Cowdog's books?
No, my instructions to her were, this is a series I like, but this is not what we're going for. We're going for a different audience, a different market, broader reach. We need to come up with something that's different from this.
And when you saw Old Blue, did you find that it was different?
I was satisfied that it was different, and I'm comfortable that she followed my instructions.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Thank you. Cross.
Good afternoon, Mr. Scurry. My name is Sherry Mazer. I represent Mr. Erickson. I want to ask you some questions about an email that you sent to Mr. Rinker from Mr. Erickson's company, Maverick Books.
Okay.
Do you remember sending some emails to Mr. Rinker?
I do remember an email exchange with Mr. Rinker.
I'm going to show you Exhibit 6, which has already been entered into evidence. And if you look to the screen, this is the email where you spoke with Mr. Rinker about making changes to the Hank series, right?
Correct.
And specifically, you said you wanted to change the stories to make them worldlier, right?
Correct.
And that's the same thing you were just talking about with opposing counsel, right?
That's correct.
And those were the same things that you wanted Ms. Myers to change in her book, right?
That's correct.
You wanted her to appeal to a more worldly audience, right?
Correct.
So you could sell more books.
Correct. And reach a broader audience who have an interest in Texas.
Because when you do that, you make money, right?
That's correct.
Because Ms. Myers and you have a contract, don't you?
Yes, we do.
And you get the royalties from the books that she sells, don't you?
They do not. She gets royalties from the books that I sell.
That's right. She gets the royalties, and you get some money off of it.
Right, over and above my publishing costs.
Over and above your publishing
Yes.
costs. Yes. And so now, these worldly changes, you didn't see them as being big changes, did you?
When I was proposing changes to Mr. Erickson through Mr. Rinker, I was not proposing bigger changes.
Because you in fact told Mr. Rinker that these worldly changes to the Hank series, well, they would be nothing big, no major changes, just small things. Is that right?
That's what I felt at the time, and that was what I was proposing to Mr. Erickson, but he turned me down.
So once he turned you down, the very next day, you got in contact with Miss Meyers, didn't you?
I had already been in contact with Ms. Myers, who had contacted me initially. But yes, the timing is close. That once Mr. Rinker turned me down, I got back in touch with Ms. Myers.
Well, the timing isn't just close, is it? It was the very next day, isn't that right?
That sounds right.
And you told Miss Myers that you were interested now in doing the deal with her.
That's correct.
And you looked over the manuscript that she sent you, right?
Yes, I did.
And that dog was named Tumbler, wasn't it?
That's correct.
But the dog's not named Tumbler anymore, is it?
No, it's not.
It's Old Blue now,
Old Blue.
isn't it? And the dog in Tumbler wasn't a director of security for a ranch, was he?
Not in the chapter she sent me, but all I saw was a chapter.
But now, in Old Blue, he is, isn't he?
He is the director of Ranch Land Security, which is a play on the director of Homeland Security.
And now, Miss Myers' original chapter of Tumbler took place in East Texas, not West Texas.
That's
isn't
correct.
That right? And Miss Myers' original book was on a chicken farm, correct?
That's correct.
But you moved her to a ranch as well, didn't you?
That's correct.
And Hank's on a ranch, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
Now, your testimony today, you're claiming that you had no idea that Miss Myers was copying Hank the
Objection,
Cowdog,
Your Honor.
right?
Assuming facts not in evidence and mischaracterizing the facts that are in evidence.
Your Honor, I can rephrase the question.
Please do so.
Do you believe that Miss Myers copied Hank the Cowdog?
I do not.
So now it's your testimony that you don't believe that Miss Myers copied Hank the Cowdog.
That is correct.
But
That's my
you
testimony.
did read the book that you published, Old Blue, before you published it, didn't you?
I did.
And you are aware that there are similar phraseologies in Hank the Cowdog and Old Blue, right?
There is some, just as there are in any two books you compare.
Well, you're aware that there are specific stories that are the same in Hank the Cowdog as in Old Blue, right?
I don't know what you mean by specific stories.
Well, I'm going to show you page 58 out of Hank the Cowdog. And it's about a town dog who has their toenails clipped and painted and perfume sprayed on them. Do you remember that?
I do.
And now I want to show you from Blue on page 39 where they say the same thing. Do you remember that too?
I do.
And you're also aware of a story of a dipstick in Hank the Cowdog, right?
Yes.
Where the dipstick's rubbed on the dog's ear.
Correct.
And that same story, or similar story anyways, is in Old Blue.
A similar event takes place. That's not the same thing as a story any more than this description of painted toenails and clipped fur is a story.
Well, now you do know that Hank the Cowdog, the story is about coyotes and protecting the coyotes. Would you agree with that?
Ultimately it is, but the storyline involves Hank being falsely accused of murdering the chicken, leaving the ranch, going out, living with the coyotes, and then coming back.
So Hank the Cowdog has a longer, more developed story than Old Blue, doesn't he?
And a different story.
Because Hank the Cowdog is 100+ pages, isn't it?
I believe that's correct.
And Old Blue's only 49?
I believe that's correct.
And now, Old Blue and your plans with Bluff Creek Publishing are to produce 3 more books pretty soon, isn't that right?
I believe that's correct.
3 more books that could possibly have the same stories as what's in Hank the Cowdog.
I'm not aware that we're here on what 3 future books could possibly be about. I thought we were here on what this book, Old Blue, is about.
Now, I just want to talk to you briefly about your deal with Mr. Erickson. That fell through because he didn't want to send the message that you wanted him to send, right?
We never actually had a deal. He disagreed with my proposed changes to his book. Yes, he disagreed with that.
And Miss Myers, she told the message you wanted to tell in Old Blue, didn't she?
I don't know if she told the message, but she reached the audience I wanted her to reach.
Thank you. Pass the witness.
All right, thank you. Any redirect?
No, Your Honor, we ask that the witness be excused.
May you what?
We ask that the witness be excused.
Yes, he may. May step down. Who will be your next witness?
Your Honor, with that, the defense rests. We're ready for closing.
All right. Plaintiff ready for closing?
Yes, Your Honor. Just a moment to set up the courtroom.
Okay. Could we have an update on their times?
Yeah. Just the one.
Plaintiff has used 65 minutes and 21 seconds. The defendant has used 56 minutes and 47 seconds. That's out of a total of 90 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
May it please the court,
Proceed.
counsel. Members of the jury. At the beginning of trial today, opposing counsel came before you and she asked you to picture a cowboy. She wanted you to picture the hat, the boots. Well, I want you to picture a cowboy too. This cowboy has tan skin, he's wearing a Stetson, he's leaning against a fence, he's smoking a cigarette. Now, there's nothing unique about the Stetson, the tanned face, or the leaning against the fence, but when you put that cigarette in his hand, now he became the Marlboro Man. And it doesn't matter if you put a Marlboro cigarette or a Camel cigarette in his hand, he's still the Marlboro Man. It's the same thing like we have here today. See, Hank the cow dog, you can change him. You can give him a different family dynamic. You can put him in a different setting. You can give him a different sidekick and change his story. But the essence of Hank, what made Hank who Hank is, what put him in the hearts and homes of the Texans for 30 years, is the essence of Hank. So who is Hank? Hank is the head of ranch security on a Texas ranch. He has a cowboy owner who sometimes gives him a hard time. Every single day, Hank wakes up. He patrols the perimeter of the ranch, looking for coyotes, looking for anything else that could harm his family, harm the chickens. Goes out on patrol. Who's Old Blue? Old Blue's a farm dog, moved to Texas on a ranch. He's the head of security. He wakes up every morning. He patrols the ranch, looks for coyotes to protect the chickens and to protect his family. Now, Hank, in his book, he ends up having an encounter with coyotes. And it's pretty intense. It's pretty scary. There's a moment there where Hank even talks about how a part of his ear gets bitten off and how they're rolling around and he's scared for his life. And then at that moment, his cowboy comes out and he fires a shot into those coyotes, a buckshot to be exact. The coyotes scatter and the book ends. So now, Old Blue has a story in his book. And in Old Blue's story, Old Blue faces a situation where coyotes are attacking the ranch. And he has to protect those chickens, and it gets real scary, and it gets kind of dark, and they roll around, and they fight the coyotes. And for a moment there, he thinks it's life or death. And then out comes his cowboy with a gun, and he fires it out at the coyotes, fires a buckshot to be exact. The coyotes disperse, and the story ends. Hank the cow dog, Old Blue. Same dog, same story, different packaging. See, the thing is that Mr. Erickson, he owns the rights to that story. He owns the rights to Hank. Because here in Texas, You can't steal somebody's hard work. You can't steal somebody's property. You can't steal someone's dog. And that's exactly what Bluff Creek Publishing did. And now we want him back. We want Hank back. So let's talk about what I had to prove today by going through the jury verdict form. This is a form that you're going to get very soon, and you're going to have to answer questions by looking at all of the evidence. Now, when you look at the evidence, I want you to keep in mind that preponderance of the evidence simply means more likely than not. Now, more likely than not, it's just the slightest tipping of the scale. If you were to imagine this scale, a drop of water, a grain of sand, a single feather in our favor, and you can find for the plaintiffs in this case. But today, not only did we give you that tilt of the scale, we gave you that tilt of the scale. We exceeded our burden here today because question number 1 asks, did Miss Meyers copy Hank the Cow Dog? Well, we heard about all the different things that Miss Meyers copied. We heard about how Hank and Old Blue are both dogs that talk on a ranch in the West, that they have a girl dog in the picture, a little love affair, that there's a coyote raid, that the cowboy fires the gun, that there's misspellings, that there's Latin phrases. But that's not it, members of the jury, because you saw specific examples, specific words and phrases. You can't do that. It doesn't matter if we show you 5 examples or 12 examples. It doesn't matter if it's just 1 sentence or if it's 20 sentences. You can't copy somebody's words. You can't copy somebody's book. So let's go through those specific examples just to think about it one more time and process out how ridiculous the fact is that the defense says there's been no copy here today. Head of ranch security, director of ranchland security. Co-op dog food, cheapest you can buy, cheap discount store dog food. Stronger, braver, and tougher. Stronger, braver, and tougher. Town dogs get their hair clipped and their toenails painted and get sprayed all over with that stinking perfume. His hair is clipped, toenails painted pink, and sprayed all over with perfume. He reached under the hood, pulled out the dipstick, and wiped it off on the ear. Pulls out the Pickup's oil dipstick and wipes it over my back. Members of the jury, there's many more examples. And both of the books are going to go back with you to the jury deliberation room. I ask you, I urge you, take the time and read through the books. You don't have to take my word for it. Even if you don't want to believe the witnesses, because members of the jury, it's so obvious you can see it yourself. Members of the jury, this is Hank. Yeah, they dressed him up a little different. They changed some words here and there. They tweaked the story. But at the end of the day, it's just like the Marlboro Man. When you add up enough similarities, even if they're common things, you put them all together, you don't have something that's just Texas anymore. You have something that's Mr. Erickson's. But we called an expert witness to the stand just to show you just a little more proof, just to give a little more weight to all the things that are evident in Hank and Old Blue. And our witness took the stand. Now, she has been teaching literature for 30 years. She works every day with children's books. And she told you that the plot, the characters, the setting, the theme, the style, and the illustrations are all the same. And she went through examples on every single category and showed you how Hank and Old Blue are the same. Now, yeah, it's true. Mr. Erickson is her hero, her literary hero. But that doesn't mean that when she took the stand today, she didn't tell you that in her professional opinion that each of these are similar. Because you've got the rest of the evidence to show you, members of the jury, that they are. But then the defense called an expert to the stand, an expert who has no experience in children's literature. She takes the stand, And she told all of you today that she didn't see the similarities. She didn't see those passages in the book that are identical. Members of the jury, could it be because she's trying to get her own children's book published? With the defense, Bluff Creek Publishing? Members of the jury, this case today is about Bluff Creek wanting Hank the cow dog, not being able to get Hank, so they took Hank. And that's why on that first question, that jury instruction that I told you about, was there a copy, you'll be able to answer yes to answer question number 1. Now, question number 2 requires us to prove to you that what was copied is substantial protected matter. Now, the judge is going to walk you through exactly what substantial protected matter means. But just to tell you a little bit about how we satisfied element 2 today. Substantially protected matter is the quality and quantity of the work that was taken significant? Is it substantial? And was what was taken protected under the laws of Texas? Members of the jury, when the judge tells you what's protected under the law of Texas, you'll know that you can't take someone's plot, character, setting, theme, style, or illustrations. And you certainly, when you put them all together, know you've got something completely copied. And that's why you'll be able to answer yes to question number 2. Now, if we go to question number 4, because you have the option of picking question number 3 or question number 4. So I'm going to ask you to look down at question number 4, did the defendant vicariously infringe plaintiff's copyright? Now, what matters here is that we proved to you today that Bluff Publishing was going to profit from the copy. And today you heard from Mr. Scurry, the president, the owner of Bluff Creek Publishing, that he stood to make quite a bit of money if Old Blue took off. See, he had a vested interest in what happened to Old Blue. He'd make money. And that's why you can find him vicariously liable, especially since we know he signed a contract with Miss Meyers, especially since we know that Bluff Creek Publishing is the name of the company that published Old Blue. So you can answer yes to question number 4. Now, question number 5 deals with a statute here in Texas, a statute that says you can assess damages if you find a copyright infringement. Now, members of the jury, the thing that you have to look at in determining what kind of damages to assess is whether you believe that Bluff Creek Publishing, whether they did it willfully. Members of the jury, today we learned that Bluff Creek Publishing, they wanted Hank the cow dog. They couldn't get Hank the cow dog, so they took Hank the cow dog. And we know they did it willfully because they took the Hank the cow dog books and they handed them to Miss Meyers. Now, they might have told Miss Meyers, do it different, but they knew she was looking at Hank the cow dog. And it's important also to keep in mind, and the judge will instruct you on this as well, that it doesn't matter whether Miss Meyers actually knew what was going on. It doesn't matter if she even knew she was copying Hank the cow dog. See, you can still be found liable for copyright infringement even if you have no idea that you're copying something. And members of the jury, we saw the examples. Maybe Miss Meyers doesn't think she copied. Maybe she can sit here on the stand today and honestly tell all of you with all of those similarities that she didn't copy Hank. But when you look at the evidence, it's clear that she did. And that's why we ask you to assess the maximum statutory damages. Now, there are 63 books that were written. And today, if you find that Old Blue infringed on one book, you can assess damages on all 63. And we ask that you do. Because Bluff Creek Publishing, they need to pay for what they've done. They need to pay for taking Mr. Erickson's dog. Because when they took his dog, they took a part of him. And So we ask that you assess $9.5 million, the statutory maximum of $150,000 times 63 books. Now I'm going to be up again in a few minutes to talk to you one more time. When you're listening to opposing counsel get up here and tell you that all of these commonalities, all these things that are the same, are just the same to Texas, I ask you to think about that Marlboro man. I ask you to picture, while all the things about him individually may be common to Texas, when you put them all together, you know what you have. Thank you.
All right, thank you, counsel. Court will recognize counsel for the defendant for purposes of closing argument.
Your Honor, permission to move the podium yet again?
Yes, you may.
Your Honor, I'm sorry. Do you mind if you don't see this while
No,
I do my
that's
course?
fine.
May I proceed? Members of the jury, it's a variation on a theme. Try to think of one piece of evidence you've heard today that is anything other than another one of those elements of a theme. In fact, Ms. Mazer drew it out for us. When you think about the cowboy, you've got the horse, the hat, the boots. When you think about a children's book about a cowboy, personified by a talking dog, well, lives on a ranch. Where else would that ranch be but the West? A cowboy, a hero, bound to get the girl, bound to have a sidekick. Every hero needs a villain, and if you're already in the West, what villain is better than a coyote? And if you're actually talking about a dog fighting coyotes, I sure as hope there's a human with a buckshot on the rescue. Members of the jury, this is just another variation on that same cow-dog theme. We saw 3 other books today in court that were written with the same theme. You heard the plaintiff's own employee, the vice president of Maverick, tell us that all of those books were about a talking dog who lived on a ranch and protected the ranch from none other than coyotes. So why isn't Mr. Erickson suing every children's book that's ever been written about a talking dog on a ranch with coyotes? Ms. Moser made another chart. And it really comes back to the first question I posed to you at the beginning of this trial, whether the similarities between the 2 stories are protected. Now this here, it's just a lot of boxes and yeses. It doesn't really mean much, but I took notes when Ms. Cox was testifying. I wrote down everything she said before Ms. Mazer marked yes. The plot, a dog on a ranch protecting from coyotes. Members of the jury, that's like saying it's a cowboy on the range. We know that that cannot be protected because it is such an essential part of not only Texas culture, but American culture. It's something that we've shared, so of course, our common sense tells us that no one can own that.
Objection, Your Honor. This has been preserved. Opposing counsel is marking up the demonstrative that I have preserved, Your Honor.
Are you making marks on it? I can't see.
Yes, Your Honor, I am making marks. Counsel asked to preserve it for use, Your Honor. If you'd like, I can recreate the original after closing.
Okay, well, your marks are in red, hers are in black, but let's make them not quite so bold. Just
Yes,
check
Your Honor.
or something where the jury can still see what she's written.
Yes, Your Honor. So members of the jury, we know that the plot, a dog on a ranch protecting from coyotes, that's not protected material. Ms. Cox, Dr. Cox said that the characters are talking dogs that are relatable. How many stories do you know with talking dogs? Air Bud? My personal favorite is the movie Up, How many cartoons while you were growing up? So we know that's not protected either. Ms. Cox said that the setting was a Western setting with ranches and tumbleweeds. Members of the jury, if that is a protected part of these books, Mr. Erickson is going to be filing a lot of lawsuits. We know that is also not protected. Ms. Cox said the theme was survival, enemies, and responsibility. Every cowboy movie ever made, Tombstone, even Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. That's not a protected theme, members of the jury. That's just another part of the general theme. Ms. Cox talked about the style. Now, there are a few different parts of these, and I want to talk about them one-on-one. She said that the titles of the dogs were similar. Well, how many cowboy movies do you know where the title of the cowboy is sheriff or ranger, and they think of themselves as responsible for the safety of maybe a town or an area? You see, both of these dogs were put in a very similar position. They were responsible for the safety of the ranch, so if you're responsible, you need a title. But there is a big difference in the mood of the two titles. Now, you'll hear that mood is something very important when you're considering whether the two books are different. Old Blue is tied to the modern day, the Department of Homeland Security and terrorism. Hank, on the other hand, is just security. It's a difference on a common theme, but it's a difference that impacts how the story feels. Now that title, that's not protected. She also talked about town dogs and descriptions. I know at the beginning of this trial I asked you to picture a cowboy, but now bear with me. I'm going to ask you to picture a city slicker, man or woman. Does that city slicker have on maybe a suit or some tight-fitting clothing? Have slicked hair, maybe shiny shoes? If your city slickers had any of those components, then doesn't it make reasonable sense that you could come up with the same description for a city slicker dog? Counsel also brought up the use of certain dialect, of certain lingo. Now, Ms. Cox said that because the dialect and the slang was similar, that she assumed it must have been stolen. But then she said that very often in children's books, you have dialect that matches the setting. Our settings match, members of the jury, and so does the dialect. So when Old Blue refers to his cowboys and he refers to the reader, don't you know? That's not protected, that's just how people talk. Finally, there was something said about soap and dog food. Well, that brings me back to Mr. Erickson himself. When he was on the stand today, he said that when he was riding Hank the cow dog, it was hard to make a living on a ranch. He said that Hank is a typical dog on a ranch. If a typical ranch makes it hard to make a living, and Hank is a typical dog, do you think that typical ranch is going to buy expensive dog food? Members of the jury, any thinking through of these similarities, they're just common sense. They're just common sense variations on the same theme. You'll get a chance to see the illustrations of Hank and Old Blue close up, but even just taking a look at the covers. Counselor, do you mind if I borrow these? These covers look nothing alike. One is dark, one is cheery. This has banners at the top and bottom, this does not. This is the main character, and this is the villain. Members of the jury, these similarities are not protected. Everything that the plaintiff has pointed to you today to say that they win, that they own this dog, that they own this theme, none of that holds water. Not a drop of water, not a grain of salt, not even the weight of a feather. The plaintiffs have failed to meet their burden today, have failed to prove enough evidence to tip those scales at all. In fact, The facts show us just the opposite, that these books are different. Remember the testimony of our expert, Dr. Shortener. She talked about not just generalized setting and theme. She told you about the feel of the book, the mood. Now, if you're a parent or if you know a young child and you're looking for a book, you might consider the mood. If you think your child is ready for something more serious or maybe just stick to something funny and light, that's a significant difference. Let's take the dipstick scenario as an example. When Hank had a dipstick wiped on his ear, oil in his fur, sounds pretty unpleasant. All he said was, well, there you have it. That's life. Moving on. When old Blue had a dipstick wiped on his back, he started plotting revenge immediately. He got mad that not only did his owner disrespect him, but that he laughed while he did it. And you know what? Blue got his revenge. When Mr. Erickson was on this stand and he was telling us not only about who Hank is, but what Hank teaches, he told us that he created Hank for the sake of morality, of seeking justice, of always doing the right thing. That is the essence of Hank. And that is what is wholly different about old Blue. So different that Mr. Erickson himself, when faced with a change, said no way. No way would he change Hank to be anything like old Blue. It's a major difference, he said. And how does he bring this suit today, saying no to a major difference and not even reading old Blue? Members of the jury, he brings this suit today because he thinks that he can own the theme of a cow dog on a ranch. He thinks that he can copyright the idea of a cowboy protecting his land. But members of the jury, today is your opportunity to tell him that that's just not the case. When you go back into deliberations and you're asked those questions that Ms. Mazer put up on the board, you know that the answer to each of those is no. The similarities are not protected. The books are not copied. And I ask you to return a verdict of $0, a verdict for the defendant. Because John Erickson doesn't own the cow dog. John Erickson cannot copyright Texas. Hank is not the only cow dog in Texas. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. All right. Counsel for plaintiff, rebuttal.
Yes, Your Honor. As I sat at counsel table, I started thinking about this chart. And this chart, it reminded me so much of Hank the cow dog and why we're here today. See, you can mark it up. You can change the way it looks, but you still know what's underneath. What's underneath old Blue is Hank the cow dog. Now, opposing counsel just told you about a city slicker, and she asked you all to imagine the characteristics of a city slicker. And she said, I'm guessing you all have some similarities that you came up with. Well, some similarities is one thing, but all these similarities, that's something else entirely. That's not coincidence. That's a copy. Members of the jury, Bluff Creek Publishing, they wanted Hank. But they didn't just want Hank. They wanted to change what Hank stood for. They wanted him to espouse a different message. And when they couldn't get Mr. Erickson to do that, they went to Miss Meyers. They took Hank, and they made Miss Meyers the mouthpiece of their propaganda. But see, Mr. Erickson, he owns Hank. Hank's his dog, and he has the right to say how Hank's going to be used, what Hank's going to say, who Hank's going to be in the hearts and homes of the people of Texas. That's Mr. Erickson's right, not Bluff Creek Publishing. And that's why we're asking you today to hold them responsible. What I'm asking you to do reminds me of a story about my granddad. And I was sitting on his porch years ago. And he said to me, "When's the best time to plant a shady tree?" I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. I looked up, shrugged my shoulders. He looked down and said, 30 years ago. 30 years ago was the best time to plant a shady tree. There's the jury. I had no idea what he was talking about, and he turned to me again and he said, "When's the next best time?" I looked up at him, shrugged my shoulders again, and he said, "Today. Today, granddaughter, is the next best time." Well, today, sitting in court, I finally realized exactly what he meant, the essence of that story. Just because we couldn't be there 2 years ago to stop Bluff Creek from stealing Hank the cow dog, to stop Miss Myers from taking Hank the cow dog and selling him as her own, we can do something today. Today is the next best time. Today we can make Bluff Creek Publishing give back Hank, give Mr. Erickson back his dog, and today we can make them pay for what they've done. Members of the jury, when you look at all the evidence, I ask that you find the defendant liable. Thank you.
All right, thank you, counsel. All right, members of the jury, you've heard the opening statements. You now heard all the evidence, the court's charge, and the closing arguments. It's now time for you to go to work. So should the jury be excused? The jury is excused at this time to consider. I've told you not to discuss the case. You may now discuss it, and I'm instructing you to reach a verdict. So the jury is excused. All rise for the jury, please. Please be seated. All right, I want to thank counsel for both sides for an excellent tried case. I have no idea what the jury will do. I know it will be very close no matter what they do, but both of you did an outstanding job. I am very, very impressed by your presentations, and to just be in law school, you're both pretty amazing. I would be proud to have you, either of you, appear in my court anytime. So congratulations on your competition, and we'll be adjourned. Please be seated. All right, members of the jury, do I understand that you've reached a verdict? If you will, please bring the verdict to the court. Thank you. All right. The jury having reached a verdict, the jury finds for the defendant, Caroline Power. Congratulations.